Dad, well, why did you bring me up? You left Mom and me years ago. And I missed your love, your support. Annie only now decided to come to the grave. He'd had another family for a long time, and no one had invited Annie to the funeral. She had learned of her father's death from a notary who announced that she had a right to inherit from that second, apparently more proper family from her father's point of view. Annie had a sister, Emily. They had seen each other a few times while Dad was still alive. He really wanted them to be friends. But it didn't work out that way. They just didn't have anything to talk about. Annie looked at the chubby blonde with green eyes in amazement. She was just like her mother, both in looks and personality. Both shouty, pushy, ambitious, constantly demanding attention. If everyone isn't looking at them, it's a disaster. And now Emily and her mother were staring at her with bulging eyes. She could hardly ask them to show her father's grave, as if they were doing her a favor. She was a stranger to them, coming from another planet from the past and unexpectedly taking a bite out of something Emily and her mother felt they had no right to. How much longer are we going to be here? Her half-sister resented. The cold autumn wind parted her colorless hair, her nose reddened, her eyes watery. Another alien trait. Emily and her mother couldn't stand the cold at all. Moreover, they simply hated wind and rain. Today, however, as if on demand, it was both. I'd like to stay here a little longer. And you can leave now. Thanks for showing me the grave. Annie wasn't going to fight with them. There was no one to share anymore. All these years her father had helped her in important moments of her life, congratulated her on her birthday, holidays, paid for her education, even dropped in for half an hour at the wedding. And it wasn't these two women's fault that Dad always seemed disgruntled, doing his time. I sort of forced myself to pretend to be a fatherly concern, but it didn't work out so well. Suit yourself, just be warned, you'll be stomping all the way across the cemetery. They won't let cabs on the grounds. Her half-sister shrugged. Annie was grateful that at least she wasn't pretending to love her. It was easier that way. She didn't have to pretend to be a good sister either. The blonde-haired, cheerful ladies got into the car, laughing loudly and discussing something, and drove off. Maybe they were attached to their father in their own way, but they were not going to deprive themselves of the joy of life, laughter, and shopping because of him. Where were they going after visiting the cemetery? That was a trait of their family, too. Alien, foreign, incomprehensible. Annie was different, dark-haired, brown-eyed, and tall. Just like her mom, she took her father's death hard. She also loved the wind, the cold, the rain. Annie had long remembered both the good and the bad. She must have seemed strange to Emily and her mother, too boring, dramatizing everything. That's what her stepmother said. Annie, what's with the sour face? You're young. You've got the money. Have fun. Live your life. I guess it's only one life. Erica said it kindly, like she wanted to comfort her. Except they were too different. She sat by the grave for a long time, wondering why her father had left the world he and her mother had left, where everyone felt deeply and were truly attached to each other, for that shallow, superficial, empty world. Maybe Dad got tired of them, fell out of love, wanted an easier life. Or maybe something irreparable had happened between him and Mom. The two parts of the continent suddenly split forever. The crack might not have been noticeable from the outside, but they had just become strangers. That's what Annie was thinking. Until the cemetery keeper tapped her on the shoulder. She had to go. "Are you all right?" asked the man, who looked more like a vagrant than a satisfied cemetery worker. Annie looked at him and thought he was probably just a part-timer. That's why he had not yet penetrated the cheerful and cynical philosophy "they die, we get rich." The tramp was still quite young, but somehow desperately thin. There was compassion in his blue eyes, and that made Annie come to her senses. "I'm all right," she said. "Would you like some tea?" "You look a little pale," asked the watchman. "No, I just need to call a cab. It's time to go home. It's too early for me to stay here." That's sad, he smiled. That's right. You've got your whole life ahead of you. My name is Damien, by the way. Let me walk you out. There's all sorts of people hanging around here. Thank you. I don't really know my way around a cemetery. My name's Annie. They talked about something as they walked to the gate. But the young woman was more on automatic, so she didn't remember much. Damien was filling in for the watchman, who'd been drinking for the last time. He didn't have a steady job yet, and he didn't have a place to live either. Annie even wanted to give him some money, but the guy refused. Just waited for the cab to arrive. He looked at the driver, slipped the bills into his hands, and said, "Deliver it, brother, in the best possible way." He nodded. Annie didn't have time to understand anything why he had paid for her, how he knew the neighborhood where she lived. Ah, yes, I think she told him she didn't live that far away. It was only about a 40-minute drive home. She just waved and smiled at this strange new acquaintance. Damien was very sad, but in a way that was his own, native, empathetic, deeply sympathetic, even unfamiliar to her. Annie thought that maybe that was what guardian angels looked like when they materialized in this sometimes cold and indifferent world, just to give a little support. It's as if one is surfacing, taking a gulp of air. Then you can hang on for a while longer. Dad would say, "Now, Annie, don't get all philosophical or your husband will run away, or maybe he's always been such an outsider." That's why he's gone into a world that's near and dear to him. Still, it's a pity that 5 years before his death, she did not see him. It hurt that he came to the wedding just for half an hour, handed over the money, and ran away. Is money the most important thing? Her husband and mother-in-law thought it was, though. Lately, Eden and his mother had only been talking about the inheritance she had received, so she didn't really want to go home. Of course, the mother-in-law was understandable. Darcy was worried about her son, an aspiring businessman who was failing on all fronts and had accumulated a lot of debt. Eden was from a middle-class family, so his mother had no money to help him out, no matter how much she wanted to. And so Darcy relied heavily on the inheritance that Annie had received. When her daughter-in-law came home from work, her mother-in-law, with the sly smile of a wise woman, would talk from afar about how the money should be spent wisely. Then she told me that she and her son are now her family for life. And family is the greatest treasure of all. Yes, I see what you're saying, Darcy. You're trying to insinuate that I should pay off your son's debts, and as soon as possible, so that you don't feel pain in your soul, and you can be at ease. Annie's family was accustomed to be blunt, not to beat around the bush. Her mother-in-law was always angry after such a sharp rebuke. "Oh, you'll never get away with disrespecting your elders. Why do you make me some kind of self-serving? I'm taking care of you. I gave you the most precious thing in the world, my child." "You know, Darcy, Eden is no longer a child. He's 35, Annie replied. The mother-in-law would get hysterical and run away, slamming the door to her room. Darcy rented the apartment and lived with the young couple in the third room, supposedly waiting for grandchildren. Annie didn't like it very much, but she didn't dare chase the older woman away. After all, she really had no one but her son. "Annie, why are you snapping at your mother again? I know your father was sick for a long time and you didn't know about it. Otherwise, we would have made up. You feel bad for your dad. But that's no reason to take it out on my mom. Anyway, where have you been for so long? Does the accounting department work late? Or is this something new?" Eden was always defending his mother. Annie could see that her husband was taking a jab at her, reminded her of her guilt in front of her father. "Actually, it was you and your mother who kicked your father out. He went down and died, and you didn't care. You didn't even give him a proper burial because he was buried with the other homeless in a mass grave. What right have you got to reproach me?" Annie knew it was wrong to say that. And she didn't know why she was hitting a nerve. She was just tired. No one was supporting her at home. Everyone was just trying to get her inheritance out of her. It was like she was an ATM machine instead of a person. How can you bring that up? And if my mom hears it, she's going to be hysterical. Well, they kicked him out and they did the right thing, Eden said. My father was a mistake of nature. It's a good thing he didn't live long. Why would a man like that suffer? Eden had never spoken of his late father that way before. Usually he just avoided the subject. Annie looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Before, her husband had seemed mean, stubborn, but not angry. She'd thought he'd just made a mistake when he'd helped his mother in an unfair way, and regretted the mistake. But now she realized she knew nothing about her husband, as if she'd been living blindfolded all this time. Darcy had disliked Annie from the first time they'd met. She'd tried to introduce Eden to a more affluent fiancé, invited her to visit in passing, and always went to the hospital when they were going on vacation. Of course, when everything was canceled, Darcy recovered dramatically. And yet they were able to defend their relationship. You got married? I didn't believe the one with whom oranges could be born. Yes, Eden seemed infantile, childishly stubborn, and even sometimes rude, but still not bad and even touching. Annie had waited a long time for him to grow up and not look into his mother's mouth when he had his own opinions. And now it seems her husband has indeed grown up. Except that, to her dismay, she suddenly began to realize that she was facing an advanced version of her mother-in-law. Over the years, her husband was becoming more and more like his mother, and the process was irreversible. And he chose another way to blame others for all problems, to solve them at someone else's expense, and value only power, money, and those who can provide these resources. And yet she still loved him, believed that her husband had not completely turned that fateful corner, where people become flawed and selfish. And the thought came to mind that it is necessary to just live separately from her mother-in-law. Then everything, maybe everything will still get better. Touching, tall, slightly overweight man with gray eyes and long eyelashes, something like a baby bear, gradually turned into a fat, bald boar, insolent, uncompromising. What if all this could be stopped? If Annie helped him, maybe Eden would remember all the touching things that had happened between them, how they'd walked under the moon, holding hands, and talked about everything. How he'd proposed to her after Darcy had once again berated her and called her unfit for a son. You know, it's time for the inheritance, Annie suggested the next morning. Oh, this calls for a celebration. You finally regained your ability to think. He disappeared into the kitchen. When he came back, he smelled of alcohol. What are you doing? I thought you were driving me. Now what? Do I have to call a cab? Annie sighed. Her husband had been drinking a lot lately to forget about business problems. It was a bad tendency, because Darcy, too, often had a bottle and then threw tantrums and pretended she hadn't had a drop. She was just a sensitive and deeply suffering person. Annie was beginning to tire of this family's habits. Is she going to be the only adult here who's responsible for everything? Don't worry about it. It's only an hour's drive to the notary. And I know some police officers. It's a weekday, there won't be any traffic. Annie tried to call a cab, but as it happened, the operators said that no one would arrive before an hour. The app also showed long waiting times. The only thing left was to refuse the trip or accept her husband's offer. To the notary, there was an appointment, otherwise sit in the general queue. So you couldn't be late. Okay, how much have you had to drink? She asked. Eden cheerfully showed between his fingers 1.5. Promise me you'll drive slowly, said his wife sternly. And there's my queen. She should have been wary when her husband said that. Eden only called her a queen when she had at least half a glass. But then for some reason she chose to ignore it. She'd let her guard down. She'd thought she'd make a quick trip there and back, and the family would stop nagging. It turned out to be the wrong decision. Darcy pretended to love her that morning. That was a bad sign too, but they ignored it that day. Do you need to slow down? There's a bridge coming up. It's raining today. The road is slippery, she asked her husband anxiously. A lot of fast drivers have lost their lives in the raging river below the bridge. That's why even the most experienced drivers drove over it with caution. If anything happens, the railing won't stop them. You're such a nerd. You're lucky I married you. You know what? Eden smirked a wicked, cocky smile and turned to kiss her cheek, like he often did when he said something hurtful, but at the same time didn't want to get into an argument. Watch the road, Annie shouted. And that was the last thing she had time to say. The brakes were already squealing and the car spun around. And then there was a violent impact, and as if through a veil, she heard the splash of water. And on the verge of losing consciousness, for some reason she whispered, "Daddy, Mommy, I'm coming to you." And she wasn't afraid. At that moment, even on the contrary, some kind of calmness came. No more deciding, no more choosing. No more fear of making a mistake. Everything would be settled once and for all. She remembered that she couldn't swim, so she didn't even try to unbuckle her belt. As they were diving, Annie turned to face Eden, unbuckled his belt with all her might, and then slowly opened the window and tried to shake him out. Her husband woke up and began making efforts to swim out. Before she finally lost consciousness, she had time to notice that he wasn't trying to help her in any way. Well, so be it. Then I'm not needed, was her last thought. Her parents appeared before her eyes, but for some reason they weren't happy to see her. They pushed her in the chest, saying, "It's too early for you, come back." She woke up from those pushes. And the first person she saw was the guardian angel of the cemetery, Damien. She remembered his name. "Wake up, then. I was surprised to see it was you I pulled out. I guess it's just a coincidence, isn't it? Don't worry, we were able to get your husband out, too." Damien was soaking wet. Water was dripping off him. All right. No more heroics. You need to go to the hospital, too. You can barely stand. "The ambulance and the police will be here in a minute," said a retired emergency doctor among the crowd. He realized that the vagrant now needed help himself. He persuaded him to wait for the doctors. "What's wrong with you?" "I got a part-time job today, and I'm late as it is. If I skip work, they won't give me a job. And then what to live on?" The homeless man was indignant. "You know what, buddy? If you die, you won't need the money. Let's get settled. That's enough of your exploits for today. You saved 2 people while the rest of us were just calling 911. If you want, I'll call your job myself," the older man said. He tried to explain to Damien that his condition was no less dangerous than those he had saved. Then he turned to Annie. "You're very lucky. That daredevil jumped off the bridge just as you were beginning to dive. Could have been killed. And your husband was unconscious? He hit his head trying to swim out the window. And you were strapped in. So you owe him a lifetime of gratitude." Then he turned around to see if the ambulance had arrived. The tramp was nowhere to be seen. He ran away to keep his part-time job. "Did you fix me up?" Annie asked the kindly old man. "If I'd come later because of the traffic, that poor guy would have been standing there. He saved you." "You owe him your life," the retired doctor said, and told Annie that her husband had hurt his head, so he might well have a concussion. He repeated all this to the ambulances and police who arrived. The cops were especially lamenting that the vagrant had slipped away before they arrived. It would have made it easier to fill out the report. "We were told you said you called the homeless guy by name. Do you know him?" the cop asked. "No, I just thought he was someone I knew from stress," Annie lied. She thought that her rescuer might have his own good reasons to avoid meeting with the authorities. Annie was very tired. "If anything, remember, call." The policeman gave his card, and she went with her husband to the hospital. Fortunately, it turned out that Eden didn't have a concussion. He could have refused to be hospitalized, but he decided it was worth it to be on the safe side. And Annie came home alone. What happened? Where's my son? The phones were down and she couldn't give any advance warning that she'd be back with a bandaged arm. Eden's fine. Darcy, he's in the hospital. You can go to him right now. Annie didn't have the energy for a detailed explanation. She wanted to collapse into bed and sleep for a couple days. There was no energy left at all. It was like she'd come back from the dead. But she was. Was it your fault? Probably just arguing with him like always, distracting him from the road. Who's he going to leave me for? If anything happens, I'll stay with your family, Darcy's mother-in-law howled. Here's the doctor's phone number. You can call and make sure Eden's okay. Annie tried to comfort her again. You're just waiting for me to die. Who would doubt it? I can imagine how upset you were that my son wasn't killed, or else you wouldn't have had to pay your debts and the money would have been safe. And her mother-in-law continued to harass Annie. The young woman swallowed the resentment lodged in her throat. Actually, she was trying to help her husband. That's why she went to the notary. And even underwater, she was trying to help him, not herself. She wanted to tell Darcy all of this, but she looked into the soulless eyes that looked like glass buttons and realized it was not worth the effort to justify herself. Darcy didn't like her. She'd always hated her. She would continue to dislike her, no matter what she did. I need to rest, Annie said, and went to her room. There was some shouting outside the door. It was the mother-in-law who continued to bemoan her daughter-in-law's callousness. Sonny is almost dying there, and she has nothing to do. That's what they've got on the family bosom, Darcy grumbled. She decided not to go to the hospital. She'd taken too much on her chest, and her legs weren't holding up very well. She had already mentally noted that her daughter-in-law would finally pay off her son's debts. And here was such that it was only necessary to add more alcohol to survive the fact that not only the trip to the notary, but also lost the car. And her son would be out of work for a while. The next day, Annie decided to follow through and went to the notary right from the morning. This is the amount the deceased bequeathed to you, said a white-haired man of indeterminate age, and wrote a number with many zeros on the paper. Annie was not very surprised. She hadn't expected her father to leave so much. It would be enough, perhaps, for a couple of apartments in the capital. And not in the worst of places. How do I get the money? She asked. You just come to the bank and they will give it to you, the notary explained. Annie wanted to go to her husband's hospital to tell him the good news, so she called. Eden, hi. How are you? I'll come and see you this afternoon. Listen, don't. My mom's coming over. I don't want you two to start fighting again, he asked in a voice that sounded like Annie was guilty of something. All right, then I'll see you tomorrow. His wife decided that she would not tell such good news over the phone. She would tell him in person. Okay, but call beforehand. I have a lot of procedures and exams to do, Eden mumbled in a resentful and arrogant voice. Not once did he ask how she was feeling. It was unpleasant. In fact, the doctor had recommended that she go to the hospital too, but she had overpowered herself so as not to scare her mother-in-law too much. And her husband, who through his own fault had been in a car accident and almost killed them both. Now he's acting all hurt and humiliated. We should find that tramp, share it with him. Damien deserves it far more than Eden and his mother Annie thought. She had never been greedy. Her mother had taught her to share even the last of it. And here, as they say, it was God's will to support the man who had saved her life. There's a reason a hobo would go to work, even in his condition. He must be desperate for money, barely surviving. She realized only now that she didn't know where to find Damien, so she went straight from the bank to the only place she knew. She'd brought a bouquet of white roses with her. Mom said that when Daddy still loved her, he used to give her those flowers. Now, you and Mom said it was too soon for me to die. Thank you for leaving the money. I want to share it with a good man," Annie thought as she left the bouquet on the grave. Then she went to ask the cemetery workers where to find the hobo. "Yes, he does that sometimes. Doesn't come here very often," was all the information she could get. That was the answer of one grim man with a shovel. The others looked at her suspiciously and silently dispersed, as if she had asked something forbidden. "Maybe he's in trouble with the law, hiding out. And where can I find him?" Annie was desperate and decided she couldn't find someone she wanted to thank so badly. What, crying? Can't wait for a cab? Out of nowhere, as if from under the ground, a hobo appeared in front of her. Actually, from the rock, she took from his hands a cup of tea, which Damien poured directly from the thermos. She took a sip. The tea was too sweet, but it seemed to be just what she needed right now. "Yes, I heard. I was just hoping you'd leave," Damien admitted, blushing. "Why?" "I wanted to thank you, actually." "The best thanks is that you're alive," Damien said, embarrassed. He was clearly not used to being thanked. "You know, can I come into your gatehouse?" "I need to talk to you," she asked. "Yes, I'm the only one on duty today," he said, surprised, and nodded. She went into a small room where the wind whistled desperately in the corners and an old refrigerator hummed in the corner. The TV was muttering something, and the sofas and armchairs had clearly been in service for at least half a century. On a table with flimsy legs there was an oilcloth with faded colored squares. "Welcome." "My residence," Damien apologized, waving his hands. "I'm sorry," he pointed to the most decent chair, on which he'd thrown a blanket. "I didn't grow up in the lap of luxury either. My mother and I lived modestly." She told her story about how, when she was still a child, my father left and remarried. And now he left an inheritance. So I decided to share it with you. The money literally fell on my head. I didn't expect it, and I didn't deserve it. Damien waved his hands at her and began to refuse. "What am I? Not human? You think if I'm a vagrant I can't help for free?" "No, I don't think that at all. You even paid for me in the cab, even though you saw me for the first time and could have been the last. Why would you do that?" She was trying to get Damien to talk, to connect with him. "It's just that you were so unhappy, so lonely. And I thought there was something more I could do for you. Well, I just liked you. I'm sorry I didn't know you were married," the tramp said, embarrassed. "I am. You guessed right. I've been very unhappy lately. I guess I have a husband, but he doesn't care about me. You rescued us and saw that he didn't even help me unbuckle myself." Annie sighed. She didn't know why she was telling him this. She hadn't had anyone to talk to about it since the accident. At least now she'd gotten something out, and it felt better. "I thought he just hit his head. That's why he couldn't help you," Damien lied. Of course, he realized that Eden was only trying to save his own skin. And he'd been wrong precisely because he'd been in too much of a hurry to get out of the car. If it hadn't been for the penknife in his safe pocket, Annie might not have been saved. The lock was jammed. "So, Frank for Frank. Do you have someone in your life whom you love?" he asked. "Yes, Kate. She's like my mom. The only person I've ever loved. I don't know what would have happened to me if it weren't for her. I guess I'd have gone down a crooked road." Damien said that when he was 15, he got involved with a bad crowd and ran away from the orphanage, and his counselor was supportive. He's been visiting her ever since. "So that's why you don't have a place to live." "So you ran away because you didn't get an apartment?" Annie asked. "Well, yes, it was dangerous at first, because I was being sought out by people I refused to help in a bad case. I warned a decent man that he was going to be robbed. He was prepared. My former associates were looking for me. And then things just kind of spiraled. I was afraid of everyone and everything. I figured I'd just make it work somehow. No one in our family has ever lived long, Damien said. What if you're the first? Annie said with a smile. I don't think so. I used to live for Kate. She doesn't have any children of her own, but she's going to die soon. The money for the operation is insane, and there's nowhere to get it, not in a lifetime. If I had an apartment right now, I'd sell it in a heartbeat. Maybe I'd have enough. But as it happens, I'm a loser, Damien said, blushing for some reason. Annie had already pulled herself together. A blush appeared on her cheeks, and Damien thought she was very pretty. What a blessing it would be to come home every day to be greeted by such a beautiful girl. Too bad he would never have a family. Damien felt kind of uncomfortable at the thought. She's married. There's exactly zero chance of that. Even if she were, beautiful and well-mannered ladies don't want to marry men like him. Damien tells me that Kate is basically waiting her turn. There is a chance that she will do the operation at the expense of the state. But it's not easy to wait, because people have been waiting for a quota for years. You know what? Can I help? Annie was struck by this simple story of love and devotion. She decided she could give half the money. It wouldn't be a big deal. She'd never counted on her father's inheritance anyway. Her mother had always taught her to rely only on herself. Of course, working as an accountant, you could not save much, but still her mother left her some modest apartment, and she managed to put some money aside from her paycheck. The remaining half will be enough to help Eden solve his problems, and everyone will be fine. But you could use the money yourself. Well, for the kids Damien encountered, who was taken aback by her generosity. Usually people quickly forgot they'd been rescued and just went on with their lives. And this strange woman was wandering around the cemetery looking for him just to thank him and help him. Damien's heart grew warm at the very fact that such a thing was possible in life. So he was not an empty place after all, and there were still enough good people in the world. My husband and I don't have children yet. I don't think he really wants any. So will it ever come to that? I don't know. But your kindergarten teacher can and should be saved now, Annie argued. Well, it's hard to turn down that kind of help. Let's exchange phone numbers. What if I can help too, or return at least a part of it someday? After much persuasion, Damien thought that he was not taking the money for himself, but to save a very good man. Perhaps that's why fate is sending them. So what's the big deal? Sure. Write down my phone number, Annie said excitedly. A stone fell from her soul. She didn't doubt for a minute that she was doing the right thing. Damien called her that evening and told her that Kate would be operated on this week. There's an open window and everything they need. But you didn't want to take money for the operation? She rejoiced, forgetting about her mother-in-law, who, as always, was eavesdropping. Annie, what were you just talking about? Darcy was wary. Who are you helping? From what means? Darcy clung to every ruble. She even controlled what brand of powder her sister-in-law bought and how much she spent on laundry. A notebook of counts and receipts was her favorite treasure. This did not mean that the mother-in-law controlled the money to help the young family. No, she just liked to count what her daughter-in-law spent on. And she wasn't going to help at all. And she taught me that in a modern family, it's every man for himself. That was until she found out about Annie's inheritance. Now everything's changed. Everyone couldn't do for themselves anymore. It was selfish. Everything had to go into the pot. Or rather, in her mother-in-law's logic, she had to put everything into the family. And Darcy and her son had the right to do their best for themselves. It was a very comfortable position. It was advantageous. Don't worry, Darcy. I only spend my own money. She didn't name the amount she'd given, but accidentally said that she was going to the hospital to visit an elderly woman who'd been helped by a vagrant at the end of the week. You don't want to visit your husband by any chance? Or do you care more about other people? The mother-in-law frowned haughtily. You know, if it were not for these so-called strangers, neither I nor your son would not be alive at all. So if you're always counting every ruble, you should consider that you might not have gotten anything if that tramp hadn't saved us at the risk of his own life. Annie got angry and stopped her mother-in-law's insolence. It's not like she's asking for anything. Then why is Darcy sticking her nose in everything? Don't be so dramatic. You can help a tramp a little if you want to. But why give money? The operation must have cost a lot. Darcy tried to find out how much her foolish daughter-in-law had spent. That's none of your business. You'd better manage your own money, Annie retorted. She was tired of being treated so insultingly. Obviously, if her mother-in-law had received the inheritance, she wouldn't have shared it. And her husband would have clutched his money. They were comfortable with what was hers to share and everything else under their control. Darcy hissed something and went to her room. She wrote down the hospital and the name of the patient her sister-in-law had given money to for the surgery. And a little later in the evening, when Annie went to the bathroom, she found the time call from Damien and transcribed the number. Now it would be possible to know everything exactly and not have to ask her daughter-in-law, a little bit at a time. The following week, mother and son had a conversation. Mom, but how can we contest the will? The surgery was done too. No one is going to get the money back. Especially not this tramp who saved us. Son, listen, we're talking about a huge sum of money. You could buy an apartment and have a steady income for the rest of your life. Did you ever think that when you stay with her, you'll have to deal with your debts? Why would I break up with her? She doesn't know about the mistress. You won't tell her. What's on your mind? Mother asked. Of course I can. We'll get that money back. But to do that, you'll have to pretend to be seriously ill. Eden, pretend you suffered brain damage in the accident and you need a huge amount of money for treatment. How can I do that? The doctors won't confirm it. No, it's not as simple as you think. Everything in this world can be bought. Money will get you any certificate you want, and they'll confirm anything. Even the fact that you are dead. My mother told me that she had already agreed with the doctor, and he does not charge much for his services. Well, I'll pretend to be sick. You'll press my wife's conscience that she should help me. And then we just sue and get back at least some of the money that is supposedly needed for my treatment. Did I understand you correctly? My son asked. That's right. That's right. Finally, you've got it, said the mother. She was beginning to fear that her son had really lost his mind and was ready to part with the huge sum of money without a fight. But fortunately, Eden is a sensible boy, just like her, or almost like her. If he were like his mother, he wouldn't have gotten into debt. But come on, she'll help him, but not out of her own pocket. Darcy didn't tell her that she would gradually have to confirm that Annie was the cause of the accident. That's a bigger, mean-spirited thing to do. And her son might not agree to it right away. Once he gets involved, he won't back down. A month or so passed. Darcy's plans proceeded without a hitch. Bribed witnesses testified that Annie was indirectly responsible for the accident. Allegedly, someone in a neighboring car saw her spouse yelling at Eden as she drove over the bridge. And he was very upset. And among those who saw their rescue by a vagrant found a need for money mean people who confirmed that Annie smelled of alcohol. She was also allegedly pounding her husband and yelling, "When am I going to get rid of you? Nothing gets you." Annie was shocked that this snowball was only gaining momentum, not shrinking. And what hurt the most was that her husband was corroborating all these statements. Eden, how can you make up such nonsense? You know it's all a lie, don't you? Had you been drinking that day? She was indignant. I'm sorry, but it's every man for himself, he smirked. His mother promised that when the money came out, she'd pay off his debts and there'd be money left over. and he is very tired of being afraid of creditors. It's not a joke, it's very scary. Besides, Erica, his beautiful Erica, with her chiseled figure, demanded to be supported. She had to become a mother of 3 children because her sister had failed in a multiple pregnancy and died in childbirth. Erica adopted the children, and now she needed care and investment in everything. Erica couldn't work and relied heavily on her businessman lover. "Honey, who else could I rely on but you?" she lied to her lovers. Erica was glad that Eden was naive enough to believe that she needed him. In reality, the 3 children were just a cover to nab money from all sorts of lovers. Amazingly enough, even the stingiest of rich men would splurge and shed a tear when she told him she couldn't leave the poor kids and would take care of them in memory of her sister. It was a good thing she had gotten the idea. At first, Erica wanted to give her nephews to an orphanage, but then once accidentally shared with one of her lovers that she was supposedly ready to adopt them, and was very surprised when he gave a large sum of money. Now Erica's life was better. There was enough money for a nanny, and outfits and beauty salons, still managed to save. And most importantly, she almost never saw the nasty, unhappy kids who were always yelling and wanting something. And it was also not a problem, because inherited from her late sister left an apartment. That's where the nanny took care of the kids, and Erica lived in her own home for her own pleasure. Eden was just one of the options. And of course he didn't know about it. And Erica didn't feel bad about deceiving him at all. A scoundrel is no better, he cheats on his wife too. "Only we have to be more careful, Bunny," she said. After editing. My wife must not find out anything Eden told her. Once she started coming to his comfort room for a few hours, since he was paying well for the service, no one minded his business. Only one problem: his wife could still show up unexpectedly, and so they tried to meet late at night when no one was allowed into the hospital, or early in the morning when they weren't allowed in yet. The wife introduced herself as a private nurse, and she didn't care that the other nurses and orderlies knew exactly why she was there. Let those honest, decent ones soak the last of their breadcrumbs in a glass of boiling water, and Erica was going to live a good life. And no one has the right to judge her. After all, she's even done her duty to her nephews. They're better off with a nanny anyway than they would be in an orphanage. And who organized all this? Their aunt. When they grow up, they'll be grateful to her. They don't even have to have children of their own. They'll have someone to provide for them in their old age. And having children is only spoiling your figure. You only have one youth. By the way, that Eden didn't really want children either. She didn't know why. He had mentioned that his father had some kind of mental illness. But that could have been his mother's idea. Erica had seen that old schemer. She's the kind of woman who'd lie without blinking an eye. She'd do anything for money. Meanwhile, unaware of the intrigue, Kate was on the mend and grateful to Damien for saving her life. The drifter didn't talk about the clouds thickening, and he didn't tell her about the unpleasant conversation he'd had with Annie's mother-in-law. "You know, my dear fellow, if you don't agree to give the money voluntarily, you'll go to jail for fraud," the short lady said to him haughtily. "But I didn't cheat anyone. She talked me into taking the money for the operation. Besides, I can prove that's what I spent it on." Damien was surprised. "Fraudsters like you know how to talk," the heiress said naively. Who would doubt it? Darcy was glad she'd copied that little freeloader's contact from her sister-in-law's phone in time. He was so scared. You just press him, and he's ready to go. "You know what? If there's a crook in here, it's you and your son. Annie's had enough. Why does she even put up with you?" The drifter was a tough nut to crack. "Now that we're talking, what do we have to say to the court? And that you're having an affair with my sister-in-law. So it's no wonder she fell for a seducer and a deceiver." Darcy told another lie. "Darcy, have you lost your mind? Do you realize what you're saying?" Damien was at a complete loss. I know exactly what you're saying. Will you explain? The money will have to be returned. And where are you going to get it from? I don't care. By the way, Kate, whom you are so careful to protect, will not benefit if I have to tell her the whole truth. Annie's mother-in-law pressed on a painful point. You're so mean. Damien wanted to punch the scheming woman, but she was old enough to be his mother. So he just clenched his fists and ran out of the foyer where she'd caught him. Eden was meeting with his mistress at the same time, and this time he made an exception by scheduling the meeting at lunchtime. His wife seemed to be at work today. She definitely couldn't make it. Eden knew full well that under the personal contract they had made, divorce could and should follow after one party cheated. It wasn't in his best interest at all, especially now when he and his mother had already done a lot of work and were getting closer to success than he had hoped. My little birdie will be married soon. Then we can appear together in restaurants, theaters, wherever you want, he told Erica, who sat on his lap, wrapped in his arms. Why? You don't love your wife, Erica pouted. She didn't need to marry the jerk, but he was so cooperative when he felt guilty. That's why she'd always pretended that she was in the mood for a serious relationship. Yeah, she is. I'm sick of her. But Eden suddenly froze, stunned. He saw his wife, who had entered the room silently and was now looking at him with contempt. There were tears in her eyes. It was like a ghost who had come to avenge his betrayal. Who did you see in there? Oh, you have such a funny face. Erica turned around and realized that it was apparently the very wife she had been carefully hiding from. She glared at the couple she'd caught and promptly ran away. She didn't want to get involved in Eden's marital squabbles. What was that supposed to mean? Annie realized how stupid a question she was asking, but it just came out of her mouth. Yeah, the nurse was harassing me, and I'm sick, so I couldn't fight her off. I'm so glad you came. Her husband tried to lie. You know what? You're not going to get away with this, Annie slapped him. And caught up with Erica, who instantly revealed that she and Eden had been dating for a long time. Erica even showed a text message from a year ago and said that if her husband was cheating, it wasn't the mistress' fault. Annie agreed with her and decided that she wouldn't talk to her husband for the time being. She had to think things over. Eden had been calling her all day, and she had blacklisted his number for the time being. At the same time, the tireless mother-in-law went out to Emily, Annie's half-sister, and started doing some political work with her. Have you ever thought that, however hypothetically, my sister-in-law might have a claim on your father's business? It had never occurred to Emily before, but she really didn't like the idea. What do you suggest? She asked Darcy. I just want to accomplish my goal and somehow get my sister-in-law to get the money. I thought you might be my ally. Do you know any secrets? Annie's mother-in-law was honest. You know, there is one secret, and it is very serious, Emily suddenly said, and told the family secret. It turned out that Annie was not the daughter of the man she thought her father was. After her father's death, Emily found the DNA test report. But she and her mother decided not to rake up the past because of the small amount of money Annie received. But if it could be about a half-sister claiming the business, that really was another matter. Emily thought to protect herself. She had never loved Annie, after all, and it was time to put an end to even hypothetical claims on the deceased's estate. Why did your father keep it all in the safe and say nothing? Darcy wondered. From her point of view, she shouldn't have spent the money to help a girl who wasn't her own. She could not understand the dead man's logic. I don't know that. But you can make it look like Annie knew she had no right to the inheritance. And yet she got it. So you get your money. And I'll make sure the so-called sister never gets more. I have a bigger share, Emily summarized. Darcy was delighted. At first she was afraid Emily would demand the money back. But she didn't seem to have any claim to the modest sum, by their family's standards. And she'd even come up with a good idea to make her sister-in-law look bad in court. She was certainly lucky, she'd thought, to speak to Emily. When Darcy had triumphantly announced the trump card up her sleeve and asked Annie one last time to volunteer the rest of the money so as not to embarrass herself, she had agreed surprisingly easily. Darcy was even surprised that the victory had come effortlessly, but she greedily snatched the bag of money. It all worked out. For some reason, Emily didn't tell me that my father wasn't related to me. Annie asked the woman she'd thought was her half-sister all along. I don't know, I just didn't want to talk to you again. When your mother-in-law said you could claim the business, it was just insurance. Emily didn't feel guilty. So what if she was protecting herself? Any reasonable person would have done the same thing. Then why did your father take care of me? Annie insisted. She wanted to know the whole truth. Mother said your real father was his best friend. Then he died and asked me to take care of his family. Like a dying request, Emily said tiredly. She didn't feel like having all this silly sentimental talk. Emily liked to live in the moment. Wait. But caring is one thing. Why did he marry my mom? Annie wondered. Oh, you're such a nerd. Your mother cheated on her first husband, your real father. She had an affair with my father, and he thought you were really his daughter for a while. And then I guess the truth came out. Why are we even bringing up the past right now? Emily really couldn't understand what it would do to Annie now. You know, I want to understand the man I thought was my father, and the real one too. She asked Emily to mail her a picture of her real dad and everything she knew about him. She was hardly surprised to see a dark-haired, balding man with clear blue eyes. She'd seen him before in a photograph her mother had carefully kept in a secret drawer. And no matter how many times Annie asked her, "Who is that?" Mom never answered. Only then she'd lock herself in the bathroom and cry. It all made sense now. So her mom was confused about her feelings and left the man she loved for the one she had a passion for. She regretted it later, but it was too late. Apparently she felt guilty that Annie's own father died on one of her dangerous business trips. He was a helicopter pilot, a rescue worker. His sweetheart broke his heart, cheated on him with his best friend. So he lost his temper in a helicopter accident. And before he died, he gave his friend his blessing to be happy with his wife. I wonder if he knew his mom was expecting a child from him. There's no way of knowing now, Annie thought. Emily gave Annie all of her father's letters to her mother. Everything she could learn there was part of the mystery. In those short lines was the whole life and drama of two people who had gone on a treasonous affair and couldn't forgive themselves for it. Emily was wrong to say that it wasn't worth digging into the past. Annie needed to figure out who she was and why. And to do that, she needed to look into her parents' history. From now on, she would visit both her father's graves and, of course, her mother's. "Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were suffering. Thank you for taking care of us anyway," Annie said at her named father's grave. Suddenly, a voice sounded behind her back. "Annie, it's you. I'm so glad to see you. You know, your mother-in-law seems to have a conscience. She called me and said she wasn't bothering me anymore. I wasn't worried about me, but I felt sorry for Kate. And that's you, guardian angel. You know, it's good to see you too." Annie offered to have tea in his apartment and told me the whole story. "So you've lost all your money because of me? Upset, buddy?" "No, I didn't. Thanks to you, I've become wiser. Well, I also realized the meanness of my husband and mother-in-law. I learned more about my own father, and for all that, I paid a small price for something that didn't belong to me. And I also managed to help a good man survive," she summarized. "In your interpretation, it wasn't sad at all. So you will start your life with a clean slate. Don't be angry with me?" Damien asked. "No, of course not. I even thought maybe we could meet in some other setting since I'm getting a divorce anyway." Annie was very embarrassed. She didn't know how to tell Damien that she liked him. He would never, ever think of courting her himself, though she sensed that he had already fallen in love with her. "You know, I'd be very happy to. I've missed you. Honestly, I didn't think you'd be interested. I'm a drifter. Dust." "Nothing," Damien said, embarrassed. "That's what you thought before, but that's about to change. Will you be my knight? Would you like me to initiate you?" She took the penknife from the table, the one he'd once used to cut the belt on the seat and save her. And Damien, who himself had said he loved books about knights, knelt before her, tears welling up in his eyes. It was all very serious for him. "So, a former vagrant and a troublemaker. A waste of space. You've always been a knight and a good man. And I'm just letting you be a knight, even though you've been one for a long time." She touched his forehead and shoulder in a non-joking way. To her, it was as if that knife was sacred. It was with it that Damien had freed her from death, and then from her despicable surroundings. Damien wrapped his arms around her knees and pressed himself against them. Never had he been so happy. The woman of his dreams had come and told him he was free from a dark past and loneliness. He believed her. "It's a good thing you decided to get married," Kate said when Damien told her he'd found the one he'd spend the rest of his life with. "I hadn't proposed yet. We just started dating," Damien corrected her. "You two are definitely going to be together. I can sense these things. When I worked at the orphanage, I knew who was getting married and who was going to split up. Your Annie's a good woman, but there's something else you need to know." Kate said that Annie's mother-in-law did come to her to argue. The name and surname of the deceased who left the inheritance seemed familiar even then. And she remembered that this deceased was the birth father of Damien, whom he had once brought back. "How is this so? My father had given up on me from the word go. And it didn't work out that the deceased wasn't such a bad man. And then suddenly it turns out that he abandoned his own son and forgot." Damien marveled. "Don't judge him harshly. You see, he was young and green then, and he grew up in a very poor, dysfunctional family. His girlfriend died in childbirth, so he was sure you'd be better off here than with him. I was young too when he brought you, but I remember. He yelled something about how you were the reason his beloved died. He thought you brought him bad luck. He didn't want to see you. I'm sorry I'm telling you all this. But you know, it's better to know the truth. The same man can be a good father to his stepdaughter and a bad father to his own son. And it wasn't my fault. At least now I understand why I always felt unwanted in this world. But that was before I met Annie," Damien admitted. "Did you ever think that you could make things right? You're entitled to an inheritance, aren't you? I could help you find all the necessary documents," Kate asked. She wanted to thank this nice young man for saving her. "No, my father didn't want me. I don't want his inheritance. Don't think I'm judging him, but I want a fresh start," Damien said. "Well, you've always been like that. You've always lived by your heart. I think you should stay that way. You're a rare man. Annie's like that too. And you'll be happy," Kate said. And she cried. She asked me to make sure she was invited to the wedding. "Of course you're like my mom," Damien promised. They kept their promise and indeed invited Kate to a modest ceremony. "And when you baptize the kids, you'll invite her too. I can babysit them, by the way. I've always wanted to be a grandmother." "Oh, I don't know about the kids. I hope everything works out," Damien replied. Annie had already shared her worries with her husband that she couldn't get pregnant. But he said that a family without children was sacred too, so she calmed down. About a month later, she came across a newspaper. Journalists described in great detail that another car had fallen off the bridge. This time a woman was killed. The man was left disabled and would never walk again. He also suffered a concussion. Erica and Annie's ex-husband were pictured. It says here that the boys of my husband's mistress have been put in an orphanage. And there are no other relatives, Annie said sadly. Don't you want to become a mom of many children? I've always dreamed of it. All we need are orphanages. A big family, Damien suddenly suggested. But we're not that rich, said Annie. That's not what makes us happy. Don't you get it yet? Damien asked and looked at her with his kind eyes the color of the sky. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to be a mom. The adoption went through very quickly. Kate pulled up her connections. She said Volland and Vincent were wonderful kids. She's the one who knows about babies. Now you're going to have your own. I know I do, the wise woman said. Though Damien and Annie didn't believe her at first, a couple years later they had a baby girl who looked like both parents at the same time. Darcy tried to save her son, but when she learned that he would remain an invalid, she gave him to an institution with a broken heart. A free one, of course. Her son didn't understand anything now anyway, and she could really use the money. So she thought. I was right. When I lost the ability to walk 6 months later, I had to hire a nurse. Of course she wasn't. She saw a secure old age, still counting on her former daughter-in-law. After all, her husband studied and began to earn a decent income, a house full of money. Maybe there would be a corner for her. As she stepped out of the shower, Vivian heard the voices of her husband and mother-in-law in an unfamiliar language, barely understanding the. Vivian Smith stood next to the high panoramic window and looked thoughtfully into the distance, where in the depths of her and her husband's large and blooming garden was a beautiful little lake, in which huge rainbow carp were slowly swimming. Here, Vivi, look how beautiful they are, Stephen said, hugging her. They were bought especially for you, so that you could come here at any time and watch our family in miniature. Stephen smiled and pointed to a pair of beautiful fish moving smoothly beneath the glass like water column. Look, the bigger one is kind of like me, he continued. And this beauty with shimmering sides, this is you, Vivian, my female, my lawful wife. See how happy they are, just like you and me. It's not for nothing that we have a name that speaks Smith. Vivi looked at the majestic fish for a long time and thought that now she too was swimming in the middle of the unknown of her own life. And just like these carp, she could not remember herself. The woman slowly shifted her gaze to her reflection in the window. She was tall, almost model height, slender like the trunk of a birch tree. Vivian had a truly beautiful appearance. The platinum blonde, who had turned 25 last year, looked as if she had stepped straight from the pages of a fashion magazine. However, Stephen said that's how they met. Mole, she was a model, about to finally leave the business, and he a successful banker, whose management was several branches of one of the largest banks in the country. Her husband told her that they had met at some art exhibition, either devoted to Impressionism or vice versa. It was something related to handicrafts. Stephen said he couldn't remember exactly anymore. I wish I could remember any of it, Vivi thought to herself bitterly. Anything at all. However, no matter how much the businessman's wife strained her memory, no matter how much she tried to reconstruct the events of that fateful day, when she was in a terrible car accident and almost completely lost her memory, she could not remember anything but her name. Her first memory, after she finally regained consciousness, was a long road home. The woman remembered the cozy interior of an expensive car in which her husband drove her to their luxurious country mansion, which stood in one of the most closed and carefully guarded cottage villages. Next to her in the car sat a middle-aged woman dressed in a chic three-piece suit of sky blue color. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup would be the envy of the Queen of England. The lady looked to be about 50, but she had a figure like Hollywood stars, trim, slim, with a minimum of wrinkles on a beautiful, but a little cold face. It was later revealed that this was Stephen's mother, Cindy Smith. The banker's mother owned a large spa complex, so in matters of youth and beauty she really had no equal, at least in their town. Already after they arrived home, Stephen and Cindy told her in more detail about what had happened to her. "Honey, it's normal for you to feel a little lost," her husband explained to her. "That accident you were in with your driver was just horrible. The driver was killed on the spot. And you..." Stephen hesitated, as if it was hard for him to talk about it. And he did not know how to choose the right words not to shock his already confused wife. "Vivi, you were literally in pieces. Your brain was severely damaged, and after the doctors conducted several complex operations, you had to be put into an induced coma. You wouldn't have survived otherwise. Dear Mayor." Cindy, who was sitting there, lowered her eyes silently and put her palm to her forehead, as if she were suddenly sick with worry for her sister-in-law. "You've been in a coma for almost 6 months," she said quietly. "My son visited you every day, hoping that your condition would finally improve enough to wake you up. But the doctors didn't give a positive prognosis at first. They said that the chances of your recovery were slim to none. You did it, Vivi. You beat death. You did it." When Cindy looked at Vivi again, there were tears in her eyes. She immediately walked over to her sister-in-law and gave her a sincere hug. Vivi had no choice but to reciprocate the gesture with a much smaller hug of her own. "I've been waiting for you," Vivi said, Stephen, wiping tears from the corners of his eyes. "You don't know how long I've waited. Mom is right. Even the doctors were desperate, but I still believed. I believed you'd come back to me. Sweetheart, thank God you did. You're home now. And I'll never let you suffer again. Never again." The young woman looked at her husband, and for a tiny moment it seemed to her that she had heard something like that before. But it had been under completely different circumstances, and what they were, she did not remember. Vivi felt as if she'd been asleep for decades, and when she woke up, she found herself in a completely different time and place than where she had fallen asleep. The woman was haunted by a constant feeling of lethargy and physical weakness, and everything around her seemed completely different from what it was supposed to be. Thank you both," Vivi replied slowly, and her mother-in-law finally released her from her overly strong arms. The young woman smiled weakly at her and her husband, and added, "I must be very lucky to have such a sensitive and caring family. I will try to remember you and everything that happened before this terrible accident. I promise." Cindy and Stephen gave a quick glance. But in the next second, a happy smile flashed across the faces of her husband and mother-in-law. "Of course, darling," Cindy sang out, taking her hand. "We don't doubt it. Stevie will help you fill in all those gaps in your memory after the coma. We've done a little bit of preparation for this, to be honest. So as soon as you're fully ready to get started, just let us know. Okay?" And Vivi nodded and asked abruptly, "Are you living with us?" Her mother-in-law was stunned for a moment, as if she hadn't expected her daughter-in-law to be so tactless. But then, realizing that it was just an ordinary question, Cindy softened. "That's right, honey. Me, you, and Stevie all live together in this lovely house. I'll keep an eye on you, if you don't mind," she said, looking at her sister-in-law carefully. "Stephen is at work all day long. Besides, he's often sent on business trips, even abroad. I think it's for the best." Vivi shifted her questioning gaze from her to her husband, and he confirmed her mother's words. "Darling, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. I'm taking a little vacation now, but I'll have to go back to the office in a couple of weeks. I want to be absolutely sure that nothing will happen to you while I am away. My mom has graciously agreed to help me with that, even though she too has more than enough worries in her complex. I'm sure you and Mom will have a great time together. You two were thick as thieves before the accident. Real girlfriends." Stephen laughed a low, clean laugh, looking at his mother for support. It wasn't long before Cindy laughed too. Of course, we'll talk about so many things, cook so many delicious meals. You won't be bored, that's for sure, her mother-in-law patted Vivi's hand gently. But Vivi felt that the woman did it a little too playfully, as if she were exaggerating their friendship. The husband had obviously embellished the true state of affairs between Cindy and her sister-in-law. Anyway, Vivi didn't say anything at that time, but only gave her loved ones another weak smile. She was indeed very tired, and the only thing she truly wanted badly at that moment was to just sleep. Her relatives didn't resist Vivi's wish and took her to the room designated for her. Nearly a year had passed since then, but the young woman had made no progress in her many attempts to remember her life before the accident. It was as if someone had deliberately separated the two halves with an invisible line, and everything that had gone before was irretrievably lost. Her husband helped her as much as he could, showing her the wedding album, which contained a lot of photos of the celebration itself and afterwards from their daily life. Here they are, happy and insanely beautiful, posing for a photo surrounded by 24 of Vivi's friends. A gorgeous designer dress the color of melted milk, fully embroidered with silk and silver crystals, which are folded into a whimsical and slightly reminiscent of Scandinavian ornaments. "You look so beautiful here," kissing his wife, Stephen whispered. Vivi only smiled softly. She was not yet ready to get as close to her husband as he would have liked. Too little time had passed, and she had not yet had time to get used to him or to feel the feelings that had bound them together, as he claimed, for 3 long years. "I'm sorry," Vivi said softly. But it was as if her husband didn't hear it, as he continued to try to communicate with her more closely. He tried to hug her, but the woman pulled away more insistently. "No, Stevie, please, I can't." "But I love you," Stephen answered her sadly. Vivi realized from his face that he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Now all he could do was look disappointedly back at their wedding photos. "Okay," he said dryly. "But did you remember anything? You can't hide from me forever. After all, I am your husband. You don't need to be afraid of me. Maybe if we started living together again like we used to, you would sooner be able to not only remember, but also feel the same love for me that I feel for you every day." Vivian felt very heavy at heart. She desperately wanted all those beautiful, sublime feelings Stephen had spoken of to come back to her memory. But as she looked at the multicolored pictures, she felt absolutely nothing. Of Vivek, not even the slightest glimmer of memory. Vivi was terribly embarrassed, so she could only shake her head negatively. "That's what I thought," his husband said in a much colder tone. "Vivi, sometimes I think you don't even try to remember things. I know it's hard for you, but you could just try to trust me and Mom. If your memory still won't come back to you. Look at your right hand." Vivian obediently stared at her right hand, where on the ring finger was a wedding ring with a huge pink diamond. Stephen intercepted her gaze and nodded briefly. "See, that's the ring I gave you the day I proposed. You were so happy to receive it. So happy that you said yes to me right away." "Stephen." Vivi tried to defend herself, but her husband gestured for her to shut up. "Please let me finish," he said, and a mournful expression spread over his face. "You don't remember now, but you and I have always been part of the same whole. We loved each other so much that we even made special vows to each other for our wedding." Stephen rummaged through his wife's bathroom cabinet and pulled out a large envelope. Inside was a sheet of coated paper, neatly folded in half. On the sheet was a typewritten love letter in which Vivian poured out her feelings to her future husband. "Here, read it carefully," she asked her husband. "If it doesn't awaken in you even a little memory of how happy we were, then I beg you to know. I'm begging you, Vivi, just take my word for it. I love you. I love you more than anything in the world, and I always will." With these words, the man left his wife's room, leaving her alone with her wedding vows and her own far from rosy thoughts. Vivian read the message to her husband and cried. Crying because she could not remember how she had written it, nor what she had felt while doing so. The vow was truly beautiful, so pure, so sincere. God, why? I don't remember any of this, she asked herself, and God the same question. Why couldn't she love her husband again and remember him? Cindy's mother-in-law's advice didn't help either, even though they cooked together in the expansive kitchen and traveled into town together to walk the places that Vivian loved most, as Cindy assured her Vivian did. It was all to no avail. It was as if there was a huge stone wall inside Vivian that prevented her from looking into the depths of her own memory and remembering everything. At the same time, Vivian was never left alone for a minute. She was always with her mother-in-law or Stephen himself. She and her husband went out into the city a couple of times a week. There they went shopping, to restaurants. Or Stephen tried to spend time with his wife, visiting theaters, movies, and exhibitions. Vivi was very grateful to her husband for his care, but did not understand why she could not do all the same, but on her own without his presence. The woman wanted some freedom, some personal space. She hoped unsuccessfully that if she could be alone with her thoughts, her memory might come back to her much faster. No, sweetheart, that's not possible, Stephen told her over and over again. You're too weak to control yourself completely. What if you get dizzy? Or, God forbid, you'll lose consciousness and fall back into a coma? Vivi, darling, I wouldn't survive that. But I'll have to go out on my own someday. You can't lock me up in our house forever. At the thought of that, Vivi immediately shuddered. She suddenly realized that she couldn't stand closed spaces and loneliness. Stephen, seeing his wife's reaction to his words, instantly became nervous with excitement. The corner of his eye even twitched. What is it, Vivi? Did you remember something? He asked strangely. No, she answered. Why do you ask? Her husband relaxed visibly at once and spoke more softly. It seemed to me as if you felt something new. Maybe you remembered that you and I had argued like this before. Vivian shook her head negatively. Not really, but you're right. I realized I couldn't be alone for too long. Something inside the woman seemed to push her, and she looked at her husband carefully. Stephen, why haven't any of my friends called me in all this time? Don't I have any friends? The phone you gave me doesn't have anyone in my contact list except you and Cindy. What about my parents? Where are they, Stephen? There were so many questions that Stephen involuntarily started pacing around the room where they were talking. It was one of those evenings when they were about to go to the premiere of the Capitol's play, which was on tour in their city. The man was visibly animated and was tugging his cuffs with excitement, pretending to correct his emerald cufflinks. What is it, my dear? Vivian looked at him incomprehensibly. Is there something you haven't told me yet? I'm not leaving here until I know the whole truth. Stephen glanced nervously at his wife, and in her heart she had an unpleasant feeling that something was being kept from her. It's just that you've chosen the wrong time to have this conversation, Stephen said at last. We have to go to the theater now, and you're talking about your parents, your friends. Let's talk later. Vivi felt a sudden surge of anger and irritation. She kicked her foot forcefully on the fluffy carpet. Vivian felt herself begin to shake. She was clearly becoming hysterical, and her husband thankfully realized it too. Stephen jumped up to Vivi and hugged her tightly, trying to warm her up and calm her trembling. Are you kidding me? He stroked his spouse's back. That's what I was talking about. It's too soon for you to be alone. He sat her down on the bed and said in a soft but sad voice, Your parents? They died a long time ago, Vivi. What? How long ago? The girl could barely ask. Her husband nodded his head affirmatively. It was a camping accident. Your mother and father were mountaineers and often rafted their kayaks on wild river places. One day their boat couldn't handle one of the rapids and flipped over. Vivi looked at her spouse with eyes red with tears. Had they drowned? He nodded sadly and stroked Vivi's cheek. The river was very cold, and the current was very strong in those places. Their deaths were inevitable. I'm sorry, dear, I'm so sorry. Vivian burst into tears and buried her face in her husband's shoulder. God, what a nightmare. Ah, how long ago it happened? A long time ago, darling. You were only 20 at the time. You told me about it yourself. Stephen gently stroked his wife's head and whispered soothing words in her ear. Then he continued carefully. And as for girlfriends, I bought you a new cell phone because your previous one broke during the accident. There are no other contacts in it, as I didn't want you to be disturbed by anyone else during your rehabilitation. Vivian calmed down a bit and, wiping her tears, said, That's right. I didn't even think of that. I'm sorry, Steve. I'm so ashamed that I might have thought badly of you. I really thought you were hiding something from me. My husband only smiled and affectionately suggested, If you want to meet with your friends, I'll give them your new number, but just be sure to stay in touch. During the walk, I need to know you're okay, you know. Vivi nodded. The news made her feel a little better. Well, that's good, said her husband. You know, I've changed my mind about going to the theater tonight. I think we have enough emotions for this evening. Let me put you a sedative that the doctor prescribed, and then we'll go to bed early. Okay, Vivi thought, and agreed. She was really emotionally exhausted. Her husband assured her that he was not offended by his wife's suspicion. He understood everything. After all, to live without the past is such a stress. After giving his wife an injection, Stephen exhaled with relief when she fell into a blissful sleep a few minutes later. That night he realized for the first time that he and Vivian had a long way to go before she finally accepted that her true place was in this house and in his, and only his, heart. That same night, Vivian had a very strange dream that later Vivek could not get out of her mind. In that dream, she could not realize where exactly she was. Everything around her was covered with bright orange flashes, and the woman herself could not breathe properly because of the smoke that entered her lungs. Bitter and acrid, the smoke mourned all the objects the businessman's wife was trying to reach in a futile attempt to save them from the oncoming flames. Vivi could feel the increasing heat in her skin, but she could see no way out of the smoky space. Then, as if out of nowhere, two blurry figures appeared in front of her. Vivian couldn't see exactly what they looked like, but she sensed that one of them, the taller one, was a man, and the other, the smaller one, was clearly a child. Vivian heard a strong male voice ahead of her. "Where are you, Vivian?" The voice repeated her name over and over again, and she tried to shout out quickly, "I am here." But no sound came out of her throat. In desperation, the woman grabbed her own neck and suddenly heard a child's shrill cry. "Mommy, mommy, here." And she began to thrash about in the blinding fiery mist, trying to reach or at least get closer to the ghostly figures that were calling her soul. She realized that she absolutely had to give them a sign that she was here, that she was alive and all was well. But the blurred silhouettes grew farther away the closer Vivian tried to get to them. Finally, in a rush of inhuman despair, the woman screamed into the void, watching the figures recede and disappear into the smoke. Wait, please don't leave me here. Don't. I want to come to you. Wake up." Stephen called out to her, and at that moment the woman opened her huge blue eyes. It turned out that she was still lying in her bed, and her husband was sitting beside her, leaning over her and shaking her by the shoulders to make her wake up. Her husband's face was visibly troubled and sad. "What's the matter, Vivi? What did you see?" The spouse, still not fully awake from what she had seen, only waved her head and removed her husband's hands from her. "It's all right, Steve. It's nothing like that. It was just a nightmare. The young woman struggled to regain her breath and looked affectionately at her husband. "Don't worry, just give me a couple minutes." "Okay." Vivian turned on her other side, trying to control her feelings. What she had seen in her dream was so vivid and realistic that she couldn't shake the thought that it might well have been a memory. Except which one? And why hadn't she seen Stephen in this strange dream, as if he had nothing to do with it? "Was that you screaming?" Stephen said slowly. "Are you sure you don't need sedatives? I could get you some pills if you want." Vivi looked at her husband with frank surprise. "Are you serious, honey? Sedatives at 10 in the morning? Are you trying to turn me into a vegetable?" Stephen tensed for a moment, but Vivi laughed lightly and threw a pillow at him. "I was only joking, silly. Of course I don't mean anything like that. Really, it's just a bad dream. There's no need to take a pill every time I get emotional." Stephen smiled, but somehow not cheerfully, as if he felt guilty about something. However, quickly pretending that nothing of the sort had happened, he offered his favorite wife to drink coffee together. "Mom today even baked us cheesecakes before rushing to work. As long as I live, every time I am amazed at her amazing ability to combine the talents of a housewife and a businesswoman." "Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed," Vivian said with her hands clasped in front of her face. "I was supposed to get up early and prepare everything. Instead, I have to bother your mother in the kitchen." Stephen only waved his hand and then gently kissed his wife on the cheek. "You just don't know her. In fact, she was always happy with all this amateur work with pots and pans. Before she lost her father, she was a housewife for a long time, raising me and taking care of my father when he came home from work. And then when Dad died of a heart attack, she got serious about the business. Daddy left us some inheritance. She used it to open her first beauty parlor." Vivian looked at her husband with genuine interest. It was the first time he had told her so frankly about his family. "I was just a boy then. I had just turned 17. At first I could not accept this new identity of my mother. But then she explained to me clearly that in this life you have to fight for your own to the end, to gnaw with your teeth, but not to give it to anyone. So I entered first the institute at the Faculty of Economics, and then got a job in a bank. But gradually I made my way into the world, found myself." Stephen tenderly embraced Vivian, and she allowed himself to kiss her for real. For a moment, the woman thought that the dream she had had was just a meaningless nightmare. A couple of hours later, when her husband was about to go to work, Vivian's phone suddenly rang insistently. Looking at the screen, the woman was surprised to find that the call was from an unknown number. "Pick up the phone," Stephen advised her, throwing his jacket over his shoulders. "I'm sure you'll be glad to know who's calling." Really, Vivi raised her eyebrows and answered the incoming call. Hello. Is that you?" An unfamiliar female voice sounded in the receiver. "Yes, it's Vivian Smith," Vivi answered, perplexed, and looked at her husband. "Who's speaking?" There was a second pause at the other end of the line, and then the same thin voice said, offended, "No, you don't recognize me, of course. Steve said that you had a memory problem, but to be so." Vivian looked at her husband again, dismissing the questions like, "Who's that?" But the man only winked at her and pointed to his watch. In a hurry, he whispered with just his lips, "I'll hang up." Then her husband went off to work with a satisfied look, leaving Vivian utterly confused. She reminded herself that Cindy was due home in half an hour to check on her and see if everything was all right. So who should she deal with, her mother-in-law or the one who was tearing her phone apart? The caller continued to bombard Vivi with endless questions. "Listen, you seriously don't remember us? It's me, Laurel, your best friend. Steve told us you were off limits while you were in treatment. We apologized profusely during that time. And then yesterday he texts us and tells us to take you out to New York City. No, he's always been Mr. Spontaneous. I'm sorry to be so blunt. Wait, Laurel, stop. Vivi tried to calm her down. Are you saying that you and I used to be friends before the accident? I mean, you're my best friend? I'm sure I am, she said, and then added a moment later, no, well, you've even been friends with Ellen for a long time, but not as close as you are with me. Embarrassed by the appearance of another person in her life, whom she did not remember at all, Vivi proposed Laurel to meet in the city center, in the same cafe where they usually liked to be with her husband. The woman wanted to talk to this girl and try to remember her. After all, Laurel was so insistent that they had known each other for years. However, meeting her friend had only disappointed Vivian, to say the least. Not only did she remember absolutely nothing of the things the girl had told her, but Laurel was also a very unpleasant person in her own right. Vivi couldn't believe that she had trusted this nasty and jealous girl with all her secrets. She would never share anything with such a gossipy girl. While they were sitting in the cafe, she had managed to wash her hands of all their mutual acquaintances. And although half of them Vivian had never even seen, she was offended that Laurel was so unashamedly throwing dirt on everyone. So, you say we worked together in the modeling business? Vivian asked at one point to interrupt her endless rant. Laurel was silent for a second, as if her internal computer was struggling to process this simple question. Finally, an uncertain smile appeared on her face. Yes, and don't you remember our shows in Milan? How you and I discussed that famous model. She looks so beautiful in all the magazines, but in reality she's fat. It still amazes me what those agents saw in her. She's a natural scarecrow. Laurel laughed unpleasantly, revealing her large white teeth. Vivi continued to stir the rest of her milkshake in a tall glass with a straw. Who do I like better, dogs or cats? Vivi asked again. What her friends stared at her with long, thickly painted eyelashes. What's cats got to do with it? Vivian looked at her carefully. But it's such a simple question. You say you've known me since high school. Then you can't help but know what kind of animals I like more. All best friends answer questions like that with ease, especially when some of them have memory problems. What Vivian certainly didn't expect was that Laurel would suddenly pull out her cell phone out of the blue and start hysterically texting something in it to someone. What are you doing? Vivi asked her with a smile. She wouldn't be surprised if Laurel was posting some nasty things about her on the internet right now. But she didn't care about that at all. She just wanted to understand what was going on here. Laurel finished fiddling with her smartphone and with a strained grin, obviously meant to portray a smile, she said. Vivian, I've been called away on an emergency shoot. I'd love to talk to you more, but unlike you, I don't have a rich husband, so I have to work up a sweat. Laurel jumped up from the table and gave Vivian a kiss. Don't be upset, Vivi, we'll talk to you later, and then you'll feel better. Ciao, darling, I'll be in touch. With those words, the red-haired gossip girl flew away from the cafe like a bright but silly butterfly. There seemed to be something wrong with Laurel. Vivian Vivek couldn't believe she would choose such a mercenary as her mate. Besides, she didn't know the answer to her simple question. And the whole thing with the phone? She was just looking for an excuse to leave quickly and not continue the awkward conversation. But what could it mean? Vivian was at a loss to guess. She had too many questions about her own past, and none of them had been answered yet. Hearing the phone vibrate in her purse, the woman picked it up immediately. Hello, honey, how are you? Stephen asked, calling her from work. To be honest, not so good, her wife admitted to him. I didn't like it at all. What kind of friend is she who only has clothes and gossip on her mind? Really? I could hear the tension in her husband's voice. You don't have to talk to her if you want to. I just thought it would be good for you to spend some time with old acquaintances. You said so yourself. Yes, I remember, Vivi reassured him. It just wasn't as heartwarming as I'd imagined. I'm going home now, Mary's already there. I could cook us all something original for dinner tonight. They chatted a little more about household matters, after which Vivian hung up the phone and headed home on foot. She wanted to walk a little, to be alone with her thoughts, and just to rest in silence after Laurel's rapid chatter. The weather that day was marvelous. Spring was in full swing. Apple trees were blooming everywhere. The flower beds were bursting with blossoming flowers. The air was fragrant with the scents of flowers and herbs. And Vivian lingered for a couple of minutes in one of the yards near the playground, looking at the happy little children playing in the sandbox. At the sight of this idyllic scene, she was suddenly overwhelmed by an incredible longing. I wish Stephen and I had a baby of our own. That's how I could sit and watch our son or daughter now. Maybe then I'd feel a lot more at peace. The young woman sat down on the bench, watching other people's children with pleasure. Some of them were happily swinging on the swings, while their mothers looked proudly in Vivian's direction. Look, envy, what happiness we have growing up. Suddenly Vivian felt her hands and feet go cold. Something switched in the young woman's mind, and she clearly, as if in reality, saw herself rocking a small child in her arms. The newborn was sleeping peacefully. His eyes were closed. At that moment, Vivian was absolutely sure that she was holding her own son in her arms. However, her vision did not end there. The woman felt strong and gentle arms around her shoulders. Vivian turned around to look at the child's father, and to her great amazement, she saw in front of her not Stephen at all. A tall, broad-shouldered, handsome man with deep dark green eyes and golden curly hair. Vivian did not fit the image of her husband. Stephen was a stocky brunette, slender but a little taller than herself. This stranger, on the other hand, looked as if he had stepped out of the pages of ancient legends. Vivian did not know this beautiful man, nor the child she held in her arms, but she was sure that they both had something to do with her. Could it be that Stephen was hiding something from her after all? Was it possible that Vivian had another family before him? But then where are they? What happened to them? Intrigued, Vivian immediately hurried home. She eagerly awaited her husband's return so she could talk to him about her vision. Cindy, seeing how worried her daughter-in-law was, became nervous herself. Seating Vivian in the kitchen, she tried to quickly question her about what had happened and how the meeting with her friend had gone. But Vivian was not in the mood for a heart-to-heart talk with her mother-in-law. "Is there anything I can do for you, dear?" Cindy asked, looking into Vivian's eyes. "I'm afraid Stephen is the only one who can help me here," she sighed. "I need to have a very serious talk with him." A shadow passed over the older woman's face, the nature of which Vivian could not determine. The young woman said she needed to rest, and then went upstairs to her room. That same evening, when Stephen returned home, Vivian immediately called him to her room and told him frankly of her sudden recollection. After listening to his wife, the businessman was a little confused at first, but quickly pulled himself together. Vivian was amazed at how quickly the emotions on his face changed. In a few moments she could distinguish surprise, anger, confusion, and then a calmness that hid all the other feelings. "Vivian, darling, listen to me very carefully," he began, setting his wife down on the bed. "What you are saying is impossible." "But why?" She looked at him perplexed. "Stephen, I feel that these people are somehow connected to me, and very strongly. That emotion, that image, it was so real, so familiar. If there's anything I don't know about myself, you have to tell me." Stephen covered his face with his hands, as if trying to shut out his own feelings. "The doctors warned me that this kind of thing could happen," he said slowly. "You've been in a coma too long, and part of your brain is still not fully recovered." What do you mean, Stephen? Vivian interrogated him. What's wrong with me? Her husband looked at her sorrowfully. Visions, hallucinations. The doctor said it could be the effects of a coma. I'm sorry, Vivian, I should have told you sooner. Vivian didn't immediately realize what her husband was telling her. When she did, she shook her head negatively. No, Stephen, no. That's the thing. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. I'm sure I saw a part of my past, but I can't figure out when it was, or who these people are to me. Stephen looked at his wife with unspeakable regret. Honey, that's the way it is sometimes. You may have experienced a powerful emotional jolt when you looked at the children. So your mind tried to deceive you, to make you wishful thinking. No, Vivian persisted. I'm normal, Stephen. I know for a fact that I've seen these people before. Stephen, I didn't tell you about my dream, that nightmare. I guessed it right away, he nodded. Yes, confirmed Vivian. I think I saw the same man and boy. Only it was later than the memories on the playground. Stephen's face immediately darkened. Vivian, let's not try to find an explanation for your delusions. I'm certainly not very pleased that you see some strange man in your visions. But as for the child... Vivian jumped out of bed and nervously splayed her hands. Yes, Stephen, I wanted to ask another question. Why we still don't have children? You just said that the memory could have been triggered by children playing. What did you mean by that? Instead of answering, her spouse slowly got out of bed, then calmly walked over to the small medicine cabinet and pulled out a syringe of sedative from there. Noticing this, Vivian stepped back. No, Stephen, I don't want a sedative. Explain to me what those kids and my visions have to do with each other. Stephen, what are you doing? The young woman's eyes filled with pure terror as her husband began to step toward her, holding the finished shot in his hand. His face was completely impenetrable. Honey, it's okay, don't worry, you just need to calm down a bit. Look at you, you're shaking all over. Vivian retreated further and further until she finally felt something solid under her back. It was a wall. The young woman's heart filled with panic. She turned around in an attempt to find a way out. But at that moment, her husband grabbed her arms sharply, depriving her of the opportunity to resist. Stephen, please don't, Vivian begged. I don't want to. I'm scared. Stephen forcefully pulled his wife against him, and in one deft movement stuck a syringe with a sedative into her neck. Don't be afraid, honey, don't be afraid. It's okay, he whispered. I'll never let you go. Never. We'll always be together. Vivian's eyes immediately went blurry. The room was covered in mist in an instant. When Stephen loosened his embrace and laid her gently on the bed, the woman looked at him with a blank stare. Her body went limp, and she could no longer control it. Vin. She barely audibly stretched out in a weakening voice. There was a mute question in her eyes. Why? Honey, we don't have children because you're infertile, her husband suddenly said affectionately. I did not want to talk about it, so as not to traumatize your already fragile psyche. But now I see that we can't do without it, Vivek. I'll have to call a psychotherapist for you tomorrow. He'll prescribe you a new course of medication and you'll definitely get better. No, everything inside Vivi screamed, but she couldn't say a word out loud. She didn't know what kind of drug her husband had injected her with, but she was sure that it was definitely not a sedative, more like tranquilizers. That's what we used to use to tame the horses on our farm, the woman's mind flashed somewhere on the farthest edge of her consciousness, between dream and reality. Vivian didn't have time to take hold of the thought, because everything around her was plunged into darkness. She didn't wake up until the next morning. Stephen wasn't around, so Vivi carefully slipped into the shower to wash away the remnants of sleep and the semi-fainting state caused by the strange medication. Vivian, Shivering, thought, God, am I really not dreaming all this? She stood under the powerful jets of hot water. Did I really remember something Stephen didn't like, and that's why he did this to me? The woman twitched in disgust. She remembered the creepy expression that had flashed across Stephen's face the moment he'd given her the injection. God, he looked like a lunatic. I can't stay in this house around him anymore. I need answers. Slipping out of the bathroom, Vivian got dressed and cautiously made her way down to the first floor. She heard Stephen and his mother talking quietly to each other in the kitchen. To Vivi's surprise, the conversation between the relatives was in English. As she listened to them, she was amazed to realize that she understood them perfectly. But when the words made complete sense to her, Vivi was forced to slowly slide down the wall, sitting on the floor. Her legs refused to hold her up, instantly becoming absorbent cotton from the shock. Did I tell you you were playing with fire, Cindy? Cindy rebuked her son. You shouldn't make fun of the girl. One day she'll remember her past, and the next day, God forbid, she'll put 2 and 2 together about Greg. What are we going to do if the truth comes out? Keep your voice down. Stephen shouted at her in English. I don't know why it happened. The doctors said that the effect of the drugs was 100%. She shouldn't remember anything from her past at all. Nothing that happened to her before me. Cindy shook her head doomedly. Do you realize what you've done, son? You've ruined her whole life. And you keep doing the same thing now. She'll never love you. She can't. She's too attached to the past. No, Mom. The businessman shouted loudly. Vivian is mine and mine alone, do you understand? I won't let her leave us, and I won't let you tear us apart. Come to your senses, Stephen. Cindy pleaded with him. If you don't stop now, it's only going to get worse, Cindy continued. Do you really want a wife who has the memory of a fish? I mean, she's really going to go crazy like that. Is that what you want? For a moment, there was a long pause between mother and son. Then Vivi heard Stephen dialing someone's number on his phone. He never turned off the keypad's sound, so the numbers sounded subtle every time he touched them. What are you doing? Cindy asked him coldly in Russian. I'm calling Vivi's doctor, he answered calmly. Don't you dare, his mother whispered threateningly. I'm not going to be a part of this charade anymore. I've put up with it all this time just for your sake. Don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of it, Stephen said confidently, and then started talking to someone Vivi couldn't hear. However, that was enough for the woman. Putting her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming in fear, she struggled to her feet and quickly ran back into her room. There, Vivi hastily threw some change of clothes and personal items into her backpack. She needed to wait until Stephen went to the airport. He had told his wife a couple of days ago that he was going on a very important business trip to London. This business trip was the only chance for Vivi to save her own life. The woman heard her husband's footsteps on the stairs and quickly shoved her backpack under the bed, lay back down and pulled the blanket up to her chin, pretending she wanted to lie down a little longer. There you are, my Sonia, Stephen said with a smile, entering the room. The time is almost 10. It's time to get up. The man stroked his wife's head affectionately, and she hardly smiled back. It's just that the day ended so abruptly yesterday. Vivi pretended that she didn't remember much about the previous evening. She stretched sweetly and put her hands on her husband's shoulders. He shouldn't have suspected anything. So Vivi played her part well, even if it was through effort. I'm leaving tonight, remember? Stephen asked her. Vivian nodded in agreement. Mom will look after you until the doctor comes, her husband continued. Cold, prickly goosebumps ran up and down Vivian's back. Be good and do whatever the doctor tells you to do, Stephen said. Okay? And I'll try to get back as soon as possible. 10 days, I think, at the most. Vivi's heart thundered in her chest. 10 days, she'd have almost 2 weeks to accomplish what she'd planned. Thank you, God. That long? Vivi asked aloud, desperately playing the model wife. But I'll miss you. Instead of answering, Stephen kissed his young wife. That's good, he said with a satisfied smile. I like you much better like this, and forget everything we talked about yesterday. I love you with or without children. Vivi nodded and smiled radiantly at him. As soon as the businessman left the house, the woman immediately jumped out of bed and continued packing. After taking some cash from her jewelry box and taking all the jewelry, Vivian felt she was ready. Whatever her husband was up to, if he was her husband at all, she wasn't going to stay in this house another minute. Vivian would find the answers to all her questions on her own, and finally find out who she was and how she had ended up in this golden prison. When the moment was right, Vivi slipped out through the emergency exit to the garage and from there slipped through the gate to the outside. As soon as the young woman crossed the threshold of the estate, everything in her soul literally sang, freedom. Vivian thought to herself, there is nothing better and more precious than this. After taking the bus to the city, Vivi immediately went to one unremarkable but decent hostel, which she had time to look up information about beforehand. She needed to hide in a place where Stephen wouldn't be able to find her right away. That's why any variant with a hotel or a fancy hotel was out of the question for her. First of all, Vivian didn't have that much money to pay for a room in them. Secondly, she wanted to minimize the use of her husband Stephen's bank cards. Vivian was well aware that as soon as he discovered her absence, it would be the cards that he would check first. Once she was settled in her micro room, Vivian opened her laptop and began searching for information about herself, and then for all the psychologists in the city who used hypnosis in their work. As she thought, there wasn't much information about the Smith family on the internet, and most of it was about Stephen and his mother. True, she did find a few notes about their wedding. However, there were no details or photos from the celebration in those short notes. This is all strange, Vivian thought to herself as she looked through a sliver of a fashionable society magazine. Usually when a celebrity gets married, the journalists are there. But this was clearly not our case. Finished with her mini investigation, the young woman turned her attention to finding hypnotherapists. Soon she was lucky enough to find a private clinic where a psychology professor practicing aggressive hypnosis worked. After changing her clothes and pretending to be a really rich and wealthy lady, Vivian went to the address given on the website. The psychologist turned out to be a pleasant elderly man in his 60s. After looking at Vivian carefully, he asked, "I even set fire to that house of yours, along with your not-so-husband and your whole complex. I hoped if there wasn't even a reminder of who you once were, you'd finally think about it and choose me and our beautiful life together." Vivian was shaking all over, but she held on with all her might. "You scoundrel," she shouted at him. "I'll report you. You'll go to jail." Stephen only smiled unpleasantly. "No one will prove anything, my sweet." "How did you find me?" Vivi asked in desperation. "Have you been following me?" Smith smirked. "I figured out where you were thanks to a tiny tracking device I put in your phone. As soon as I got here, I immediately rushed over to where you wanted to sit out those few days. When I heard you'd gone to counseling, I knew anything could happen. So I came straight after you." The man made another circle around Vivi. "If you want to know where your kid is, I'll tell you he's in an orphanage. Only I don't know which one. I had my men drop your boy off with them. They didn't even tell me where, so you wouldn't be able to find him if anything went wrong." Vivi rose slowly to her feet, looking at him with all the hatred she could muster. "You're a monster," Vivi spat in his face. "We'll never be together. Not even if you're the last man on earth. Even if you erase my memory. I won't remember my own name. We'll never be together. Do you hear me? Never. Because I hate you and I'll always feel that hatred in my heart. Like I felt you were nothing to me. Like I felt I had Greg, the man I will love with all my heart forever, even after he's dead. The exhausted Vivi, bent in half, expected that the businessman would probably just want to kill her now. But to her great amazement, Stephen's face was contorted with a grimace of genuine heartache. But it lasted only a moment, and then contempt flashed in his eyes again. Fool. What a fool you are, Vivian. I gave you everything. I've given you everything, and you ungrateful hysteric, have gone into things you shouldn't have known. Stephen kicked the woman in the stomach with his foot, and Vivian instantly gasped in pain. Flashes flickered in her eyes. You're a plant, Smith said, pulling out the barrel. And you asked for it. If you had only listened to me, I would have spared your stupid heart. Things might be very different now. Vivian, realizing that the inevitable finale was coming for her, closed her eyes tightly and whispered softly. Greg, my darling, I'm coming to you, my darling. And at the same second, Vivi felt a shadow fly past her. There was a rumble, but the woman felt nothing, only shrank with horror. When she opened her eyes, she saw someone big and strong hitting Stephen one after another, knocking the gun out of his hands. You bastard, you got it. She heard a quiet voice that sounded painfully familiar. Greg, Vivian said, not believing her ears. Is it really you? Are you alive? Greg knocked out the rogue businessman, then slowly turned around and rushed to his wife. In an armful of tenderly squeezed in an embrace exhausted sobs Vivi. It's all right, sweetheart. It's definitely going to be okay now. I'm alive. He's alive. She nodded toward Stephen. You didn't kill him? Greg only grinned slyly. Don't worry, the bastard will live. He's only in the cell now. I videotaped him abusing you and what he said about our farm. I think that'll be good enough for the police. Vivian gently pulled away from her husband. Greg, tell me what happened then. How did you manage to get out of the house? And Eden, did you hear what he said about our son? The giant man stroked his lover's cheek and smiled gently at her. Calm down, Vivi. At home we live in another city now. I couldn't stay here knowing you were dead, but that's what I thought at the time. Greg told Vivian that he managed to get out of the burning house in time when he found that everything around was on fire. They stunned me, the Bigfoot hombres. I saw them trying to get into the house, so I wanted to fight them back. But they were strong, the bastards. I woke up in the back room. I guess they were hoping I'd burn to death in there. What they didn't know is that we have a small exit there. I'd accidentally blocked it with gardening tools and I couldn't see it from the inside. Greg looked around to see if Stephen was all right, that is, if he had regained consciousness. Luckily, he was still unconscious. That's how I got out. I broke the glass first and then I tore up the boards to make it easier, Greg explained to his wife. His look became incredibly sad. He hugged Vivi again. She hugged him back. I buried you, Vivian, he said slowly. When the fire was put out, all I found was your bracelet and ring. I thought you were lost in the flames. Vivi looked at Greg with an inexpressible love and devotion in her eyes. No, they put me to sleep and took me away. Did you hear that? Yes, and he'll have to answer for it in court. You'll see, the man assured her, his eyes burning with righteous anger. I found my son almost immediately. I couldn't believe that they were ready to send the child to the grave innocently. Thank God, Greg said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Vivi saw the first gray in his temples. She reached up and stroked his hair. You found our son, you saved the baby. These thugs are not as smart as their master expected them to be, her husband explained to her. They gave our son to the first nearest orphanage. I didn't even have to go to the neighboring region. I took him right away. He, of course, was frightened a lot, but nothing. The guy is strong. Our dad was waiting for you to come for me, he said. He believed you'd save me from bad people. Vivian did not restrain her emotions any longer and kissed her lawful wedded husband firmly. Take me to our house, please, his wife asked him. I really want to see my son, and I really, really want to be with you in our new home. Greg smiled, and wrinkles gathered in small clumps in the corners of his eyes. Of course, my favorite. We'll call the police first. We can't leave this gentleman here like this. When the police arrived, Greg explained everything thoroughly and showed them the tape. The investigator was shocked to learn that such a powerful man as Smith could go to such a heinous crime because of a trivial obsession with a woman, even one as beautiful as Vivian was. Now, Vivi's false husband faces a long prison sentence. His mother, Stacy, upon learning of what had happened, immediately left for another city. She no longer wanted to help her son in his crimes. You've made your own mess. Now you have to clean it up, she said to Stephen. Greg and Vivian returned to their new home in a neighboring town. Greg, who has lost almost everything, is not discouraged. He hopes that in time he can build a new farm for their family and start over. He still has connections with some of his former employees, so he has no doubts about success. Eden, upon learning that his mom was alive, took it as the truest of miracles a toddler who is almost 5. Now every day puts a candle at home for the health of his mom, because he loves her very much and missed her very much all this time, while Vivian was actually in captivity at the businessman Smith. The Smith family is together again, and now truly happy. After all, they were able to pass such tests which not every person on the birth falls. Vivian sincerely believes that only devotion and faith in her heart helped her to eventually remember her beloved husband and son and rediscover herself. When Maggie went to the bank to collect her inheritance, she expected nothing. And when the orphan opened the safe deposit box, on another cold January morning, Maggie lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. For 6 months now, every day had begun the same way. She lay there and thought with horror that a dull, meaningless day lay ahead of her. Maggie was not yet 30 years old. She wasn't bad looking, but finding a husband and building a family had never worked out for her. Her rare liaisons with men didn't last more than 6 months. She didn't understand why she had no luck on the personal front. Either men were not suitable, or her character was not quite good. But Maggie wasn't too worried about that. She didn't want to start any serious relationships. For several years, she had been immersed in caring for her elderly grandmother, the kindest woman who had raised Maggie since she was 3 years old, ever since her parents had been killed in an accident. She and Grandma had bailed each other out back then. The grandmother had kept the girl out of the orphanage by taking over her upbringing, and Maggie gave her grandmother new meanings in life, the meaning of which was to raise her beloved granddaughter. Most likely, this is what helped the woman cope with the loss of her only son and daughter-in-law. 3 years ago, the grandmother fell ill. She could move around the apartment by herself, but still she needed constant care. And of course, her granddaughter began to take care of her, driving her to doctors, shopping, doing all the housework. At the time, Maggie was 26 years old. She had just found a good job with a decent salary and was preparing to go for a promotion. Maggie even considered moving out of her grandmother's apartment into her own first rented, and then planned to take out a mortgage. But the illness of the old woman crossed all these plans. Without thinking, Maggie forgot about career heights, stayed in her old position, and all her free time devoted to her grandmother. They were unpretentious in life, so Maggie's salary and grandmother's payments were enough to pay for doctors and medicines. Maggie had little memory of her parents. They were often on the road before their deaths, so they left their young daughter to her grandmother. Because of this, Maggie had only a few memories of her parents, and she thought some of them were just dreams. And she and her grandmother hit it off from the start. The older woman had managed to replace Maggie's father and mother. In all the years they had lived together, they had never had a single major conflict. Even when Maggie was going through a transitional age, it was probably because her grandmother worked as a school teacher and had a good understanding of how to get along with children. For Maggie, her grandmother was a self-evident part of her life, and she didn't think about her death. Not even when the woman had had an unfortunate accident 3 years ago. Maggie pushed away thoughts of her grandmother soon to be gone. She just gave all the help she could, tried to organize good treatment, and hoped for the best. Grandma didn't get any worse before she died. She wasn't taken to the hospital. She spent the day as usual. She read, watched TV, called her neighbor, and inquired about her granddaughter's life. Toward nightfall, she said goodnight to Maggie and she went to her room. The next day, Grandma didn't wake up. The days of the funeral had merged into one terrible dream for Maggie. She didn't even remember how she had organized everything. How did the funeral and the wake go? She wanted to get over it and forget it all. But after all the funeral procedures came an even worse state for Maggie's silence. It was not only psychologically but physically hard for her to return after work to an apartment where no one was waiting for her. An apartment where the TV didn't work, where there was no aroma of something delicious, where there was no warmth and coziness. She hated waking up in the morning for exactly the same reason. No one else wished her a good morning and good luck before work. She didn't understand why she had to get up every morning and come home every evening. 6 months of despondency, only occasionally replaced by happy evenings spent with her friend in cafes or at each other's houses. This morning didn't bode well for the day to be any different from the previous ones. Maggie reluctantly got up, drank her coffee and sandwich, and got ready for work, despite her good paycheck. Maggie dressed, to put it mildly, without glamour, wore the same things for several years, and her winter down jacket, from which every now and then the fluff was trying to pop out, had recently celebrated its 5-year anniversary. So from the outside, she gave the impression of a poor girl. A typical gray mouse. Almost running, she reached the streetcar stop and went to work. And at 8:55, the office was already noisy. The bosses were strict about tardiness. Maggie walked into her office, which her friend Samantha and 2 other female co-workers shared with her. "What are you like? You're not alive, are you?" Maggie's friend asked thoughtfully as she sat down in her seat. "I don't know, I can't do the same thing every day. It's boring." Maggie showed a thick stack of papers on her desk. "What's all this for?" "You didn't say that when you walked into this office," Samantha reminded Maggie of her first days on the job 4 years ago. Indeed, Maggie was an exemplary worker with bright eyes and a well-functioning brain. She genuinely loved her job. She didn't just go to it for the money. Colleagues were even afraid to approach her at first, thinking that such efficiency hides a cunning, bossy girl, ready to go over the heads of other employees for the sake of her career. But Samantha managed at some point to break through this workaholic shell and see her as a very ordinary, modest, and kind girl. Most likely they managed to get close on the contrast. Unlike Maggie, Samantha was an extremely sociable, cheerful girl, although she was not characterized by great efficiency. Sometimes even Maggie had to cover Samantha's shortcomings in front of her superiors, but such help from her colleague was not worth much trouble. Things had changed in the last 6 months. Maggie would come to the office, permeate the office, perform her work tasks, and leave. Each time, her friend tried to cheer Maggie up in some way. This time, she made the same attempt. "Meg, why don't we go check it out? I heard they opened a new bar near here today. The girls say it's a great place." Well, why not? It had been over a month since the last time she'd been out with her friend, and Maggie decided to give herself a break. But a couple minutes later, she realized, "Oh no, I can't tonight." "Why not? Come on, we got to get back to normal. You want to go shopping before the bar? 'Cause you've turned into such an asshole." No, I'd really like to go, but I already made an appointment to go to the bank today. Is there something wrong with your card, or did your paycheck not come in yesterday? There's nothing wrong with my paycheck, it's just, yesterday was exactly 6 months since Grandma left. I've got an inheritance to settle. I thought I wouldn't have to do anything else but file the deed to the apartment. But the notary called and said there's a safe deposit box in the bank. I'm going to go check it out today. So let's reschedule the bar for tomorrow, for example. Okay, if that's the case, sure. Maybe I'll go with you just in case. You're going out of the bank alone tonight, you know it's dangerous. Don't worry about it, I'll go by myself. There won't be any diamonds. My grandmother was a school teacher, not a rich woman. I wouldn't be surprised if there's been some kind of mistake and the bank just turns me back home. Like the safety deposit box got mixed up. It wasn't really Grandma's. The friends finished talking and got to work. The day was routine. The boss came in only once, politely asked her friend to correct mistakes in the report and left. And Maggie periodically returned her thoughts to this mysterious safe deposit box, about which she had told. The girl did not think much about the inheritance and perceived the upcoming trip to the bank as a normal bureaucratic procedure. But now it no longer seemed to her as something ordinary. If it was not a mistake, what could lie there? Perhaps some family jewelry. But then why in such a strange place? A safety deposit box. Jewelry is usually kept at home to be admired or worn if desired. That's what they're for. This was a safe deposit box. Maggie couldn't even remember the last time her grandmother had been to the bank, probably before she got sick. Anyway, the closer it got to the end of the day, the more interested Maggie became. Finally, the clock showed 6 p.m., and all the employees, as if on cue, began to pack up to leave. Maggie was not usually one of them. She could stay in her office alone until 7, 8, and sometimes even 21. Since the interest in work was lost, she gave up this habit and began to return with everyone else. Perhaps in the crowd of co-workers walking to their bus stops, Maggie felt less lonely. This time, too, she jumped up with everyone else, but not out of any desire to overcome loneliness. She had to take the streetcar to the bank, but in the other direction. Maggie said goodbye to Samantha and a few other co-workers and ran to the stop. The streetcar came almost immediately. Maggie got on and didn't even have to take an empty seat, sitting near the door. There were only 2 stops to go, but for Maggie the time dragged so slowly that it seemed to her as if the streetcar was going across town. She kept glancing at her watch, worried about not getting there before the bank closed. It closed at 7 p.m., which was why Maggie was so worried. When she got to the right stop, Maggie jumped off the streetcar and ran to the bank. Fortunately, it was still half an hour before closing time. The girl took a little breath and entered the premises, taking a number in the electronic queue. Maggie didn't have to wait long. There wasn't particularly anyone else in the bank at this time. Maggie walked over to the right window and sat down near it. The banker, a full-bodied man in his 40s, was obviously going home early and was already putting things in his briefcase. "Hello," Maggie said at first and took out her papers. "Hello," the banker said, giving Maggie a wry look. "I need access to a safety deposit box." The man leaned slightly out of the window and looked at Maggie again, more carefully. "Why do you need a safety deposit box?" "I want to see what it looks like," Maggie replied irritably, glancing at the banker's name tag, which read in gold letters, "Stephen Swan, Senior Officer." "Stephen, don't you know what people need a safety deposit box for?" "Don't be rude, girl," replied the banker sternly. "Give me the number of the box. Give me your passport." The banker looked through the passport, wrote down some data, entered the number of the safe deposit box into the computer. "This box is not in your name," the man said in the same stern tone. "That's right, it's not in my name. The box belonged to my grandmother. She passed away 6 months ago and I inherited it. Here's the certificate of inheritance." Maggie handed the paper to the banker. "It says there was a safe deposit box in the property." The banker fidgeted with the certificate, looked at the passport again, and went somewhere else. 2 minutes later, he came back and said unhappily, "All right, follow me." Maggie went with him into another room. The banker opened a heavy metal door, behind which there were hundreds of cells of different sizes. The man looked around and went to one of the boxes. He slipped a small key into the keyhole and opened the lock. Sighing heavily, he reluctantly looked into the cell and stunned. After standing for a couple of seconds, in a quiet voice he was able to utter, "Approach, please. The cell is open." Maggie walked leisurely to the box, as if she wanted a little suspense, and there was plenty of suspense to go around. In the box was a bar of gold. "Can I take it?" Maggie asked in a whisper. "Of course it's your property now," the banker replied kindly. He frowned unhappily and then disappeared. Maggie took the ingot in her hands. The bullion looked exactly like it did in the movies. It glistened, shimmering under the light of the bank lamp. It was stamped with the inscription 999.91 thousand grams. The first number means the grade, the banker explained to Maggie, and the second is the weight. On the back there was another stamp with a number and other necessary information to prove authenticity. Maggie didn't really listen to what the banker was telling her. She couldn't believe that she was holding a kilogram of pure gold. Even to the touch, it was different from other metal objects of the same size. It seemed to her that the ingot was soft. It felt warm. "What am I supposed to do with it?" Maggie asked rhetorically. The banker shrugged in response. His eyes showed that he was upset that the bullion was not his. An odd reaction for a banker who operated with large sums of money and jewelry on a daily basis. Perhaps he had only served wealthy clients before, and the appearance of large sums of money was no surprise to them. And here a poor girl got a fortune, just like that, instantaneously. Some people dream of such things all their lives, and perhaps the banker was one of those people. After standing for a few seconds, he warned Maggie that he had to go and get a form for receiving the contents of the safe deposit box. Maggie didn't bother with the bureaucratic wording and continued to look at the gold. The banker put another bank employee in his place, apparently to keep Maggie from robbing the bank. Maggie shifted her gaze from the bullion to her open safe deposit box. There was some cardboard at the bottom of the box, which was the same color as the box itself, so the bankers didn't pay attention to it. "Excuse me, please," Maggie said to the stone-faced employee. "There's something else in the box. Can I take that too?" "If the box is yours, you can," the emotionless employee replied. Maggie carefully pulled out the cardboard. It turned out to be a heavy paper envelope. There was no addressee, no sender's name, and no stamps on the envelope. Maggie simply put the unopened envelope in her bag. She realized there was some message from her grandmother inside, and she didn't want to read it in front of strangers. "Before you leave, you'll need to sign some papers," the banker suddenly returned. "Sure. Where do I have to go?" "It's protocol to sign right here." "But do you really want to take this with you?" The man nodded his head at the ingot. "Yes, why do you ask?" Maggie wondered. "Wouldn't it be safer to leave it in the safe deposit box? Or do you want to sell the bullion right now?" "No, I have all my accounts in another bank, and I think that's where the bullion should be deposited in the near future. I like things to be in their proper place." For a few minutes, Maggie thought that it was really safer to leave such wealth in the bank. But it was not only the desire to move the bullion to another bank that possessed her. The little gold brick had a magical attraction, and Maggie did not want to give it back right away. She wanted to look at it, put it somewhere at home, maybe even show it to a friend. As you wish. It's your right, the banker said quickly. Follow me. Having completed all the bureaucratic procedures with the registration of the bullion, Maggie went home. She didn't want to take public transportation with the gold, so she called a cab. During the ride, she had a twofold feeling. On the one hand, she was overwhelmed by the euphoria of knowing that she was carrying a kilogram of gold worth about $1 million in her bag. On the other hand, she was periodically overcome with panic anxiety. She kept glancing askew at the cab driver, drawing in her mind stories in which he would take her out into the woods and take away her bag. Then Maggie scrutinized the window to see if the cab driver was taking her the right way. "Say, why are we going this way?" she asked when the car turned off the avenue that ran along the streetcar tracks. "There are repair works ahead," replied the driver. "They're on their way," the cab driver replied calmly. "We'll be stuck in traffic for half an hour. But this way we go faster in the yards." Maggie's heart began to beat strongly. It became difficult for her to breathe. After a couple minutes, she managed to pull herself together. She took out her cell phone and dialed 112 on it beforehand. Maggie watched the road even more carefully. It was getting dark outside and it was hard to see anything. Then she moved to the middle of the back seat of the car and looked out the driver's window. By the light of the headlights, she recognized a small street that ran along the main avenue. It was a little over 1 kilometer to the house. Maggie calmed down a little and moved to the passenger door again. "Don't worry, we'll be there in a few minutes," the cab driver said carefully, watching Maggie's tossing about in the back seat. "Yes, all right," Maggie answered him calmly, her voice trembling slightly. Less than a minute later, the car turned again. "Are you off the right road?" the navigator said loudly. And Maggie realized she couldn't stay in the car any longer. "Stop here, please," she shouted. "What do you mean here?" "We're just a little bit away," the cab driver replied calmly. "I know, but I need to get out here urgently." "Okay, whatever you say," the cabbie sighed heavily and stopped the car. Maggie quickly shoved the fare money into the cab driver's hands and got out of the car. Almost at a run, she headed toward her house. It wasn't much farther, but the second strange turn seemed too suspicious to Maggie. She ran down the very street that ran along the avenue, and soon she saw that there was a road service on it. And right in the middle of it was a fenced-in hole dug. The workers were changing a pipe that ran across both the avenue and this street, and so there was nothing suspicious in the cab driver's sudden turns. He was, however, looking for the easiest way to get to the right house. Maggie breathed a sigh of relief and walked toward her house with a quiet step. She even felt a little ashamed of her overcautiousness. How could the cab driver have known that she had something expensive in her bag? Yes, sudden riches rarely lead to good things. It wasn't long before Maggie saw her 5-story building on the horizon. Just as she turned into the yard, someone tugged her purse sharply, but Maggie held it firmly in her hands. She turned around and saw a man with a scarf hat wrapped around his face. He was pulling the bag toward him. But Maggie had no intention of letting her go. She started screaming loudly. At that moment, 2 men approached them, and the man in the scarf, apparently frightened, let go of the purse and started to run. No one caught up with him. The men approached Maggie. "Are you all right?" one of them asked fearfully. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you," Maggie said, out of breath. "I'm calling the police," the other man said, pulling out his cell phone. "Thank you." Maggie turned to both of them. "I don't think he would have gotten away if it wasn't for you." "Why are you walking alone at this hour?" "I'm used to it. I've been walking alone all my life." And about this time, Maggie answered. She talked to her casual acquaintances for a while longer, and the police arrived at the scene. The officers quickly took statements from Maggie and witnesses, took pictures of the purse, and went to the next call. Maggie thanked the men again and went home. She didn't like that the police officers left so quickly. It even seemed to Maggie that they weren't even going to look for anyone. They just machine-filled all the paperwork and drove away. She realized that the cops had a heavy workload, but they could have at least taken her to the station so that the experts could fingerprint the bag, make a sketch, and do everything else they usually did in detective shows. Almost immediately, however, Maggie remembered that the man was wearing gloves, and fingerprinting her bag probably didn't make sense. She went up to the second floor, entered the apartment, and felt fear again, a real animal fear for her life. What if the perpetrator decided to come back? After all, if he attacked Maggie right outside her house, that meant he knew her home address. Maggie pulled out her cell phone and selected one of Samantha's contacts. "Come see me soon, please," she said. "I'll explain everything later, but it's really hard for me to be alone right now. Thank you. I'll be waiting." Maggie was afraid that her friend still went to the bar after work and would not see her call. But from the sounds of it, Samantha was already home. In fact, Maggie had no one else to call for help. Her childhood friends had moved away to different cities, and Samantha was the only person she had left who was truly close to her. When her friend agreed to come over, Maggie felt much calmer. She made tea and sat down on the couch. She placed her purse next to her, taking a few sips. Maggie took the purse in her hands, carefully undid the zipper, and opened it. The gold bar was in place. Before she did so, she had thought that the gold might not be in the purse, because after the attack she hadn't even checked to see if the man had taken anything. But everything was fine. Maggie didn't bother to pull out the bullion, zipped up the bag, and set it back on the couch. What could it have been, she thought? An accident? No, I don't believe in such coincidences. Right outside my house, a bandit purposely tried to snatch my purse. There's no such thing as coincidence. Then who set him on me? The only person who knew she had the gold bar was the banker, Stephen. How much animosity had he treated her with? And when he saw the bar, a completely different face. That's when he plotted to take it from me, Maggie decided. He's seen my passport, he knows where I live. He's a rascal. He's been away several times, probably calling his accomplices. Maybe it's a standard pattern for them to hunt down lonely women and take their valuables. What a nightmare. Maggie mentally uttered many more words to the banker, but stopped herself at one point. Why him, after all? Didn't anyone else know that I might have something valuable in my bag? Like the other bank employees or Samantha. I told her I was going to the bank to collect my grandmother's inheritance. Maggie immediately dismissed that theory. She had known her friend Samantha for so many years, and she had never shown that she was capable of something like this. Yes, Samantha didn't have a rigid discipline. She had a rather infantile attitude to life. But committing crimes. And against whom? Against her best friend? No, that was definitely out of the question. After sitting for a while longer, Maggie remembered the letter. She opened the inside pocket of her bag and pulled out an envelope. Carefully she opened it and took out a quadruple folded piece of paper and unfolded it. As expected, it was a letter from her grandmother, written in beautiful handwriting in black ink. The lines were scrawled there, "Dear Maggie, if you are reading this letter, it has probably been over 6 months since I have been gone from this world. I am writing this to you at a time when you are diligently preparing for your first university exams. You are going through a difficult period, searching for yourself, new challenges from life. That's why I didn't start this conversation right now, but decided to write a letter to the future. Maybe the day will come when I will be ready to tell you this story personally, but I realize that I am not getting younger every year. So just in case, I will tell you everything in a letter. After all, death may precede the moment of my readiness to talk to you. As a child, you sometimes asked about your grandfather, and I usually evaded answering your questions. As you may remember, your grandfather Archie Swan was a geologist, looking for minerals in the east of the country. He and his group found some gold deposits. This place was a mile from the gold mines known to the state at that time, and the group did not hurry to inform the local authorities, but decided to organize their own mining. I don't think it was a personal desire of your grandfather and his colleagues to get rich. He told me that he just didn't trust the local authorities. Most likely they would have organized underground mines and sent the geologists back to town quickly, not wanting to let that happen. The group has started to develop the mine on their own. I don't know if it was really like Grandpa told me. In any case, I don't judge him. And you don't judge, remember. I've been telling you, since you were a kid, that you can't judge anyone in this life. Anyway, the place turned out to be rich. They mined up to 100 grams of gold a day. And so it went on for almost 2 weeks. One day they were spotted by workers from the official mines. One of them was called Damien Stephen. They had known Grandpa for several years. They were even family friends at first. Damien used to come to our house. But after that, it was like a cat got between them. I guess your grandfather didn't like the fact that Damien was going to frame the mine superintendent to take his place. They've been enemies ever since. Of course, when Damien saw that your grandfather was doing illegal mining, he immediately wrote a denunciation on the whole group. It was the 1960s, the so-called thaw. People were coming out of prison, and for us, the exact opposite happened. Your grandfather was sent to a camp for 5 years for embezzling state property, or whatever they called it. We were lucky 10 years before that. The same crime had been punished much more harshly. Your dad was 2 years old then, and until he was 5, I brought him up on my own. Grandpa was released a couple of years early for good behavior. I didn't know at that time that when the group was arrested, they didn't hand over all the gold they had gotten to the police. But somehow Damien found out about it. As soon as he learned that my grandfather was free, he began to torment our family and the families of other members of the geological group. For some reason, he demanded that the gold be returned to him and kept threatening to turn Grandpa in to the authorities. Then one day, Grandpa and his comrades got fed up with Damien's behavior. I don't know what they did to him, but after that they put Damien in jail for 5 years. 2 years later came the news that he died in prison. From then on, we lived like a normal Soviet family. Grandpa tried not to remember about the years spent in the camp, and I didn't remind him either. 30 years passed, the Soviet Union collapsed. And the time came when everything became possible. We were excited about your birth and forgot about what happened 30 years ago. But soon Grandpa became ill. He was still on his feet, but he realized he didn't have long to live. One day when he and I were alone in the apartment, your grandfather pulled back the closet, cut a piece of linoleum from under the floorboards with a knife, and pulled out several paper bags. He opened them up and laid out many, many little pieces of gold on the table. They were dirty, unformed lumps, as if they had just been pulled from a mountain stream. I realized that back then, in the 60s, he never gave all the gold he had mined to the state. That same day, we took the jewelry to the smelting plant. We were not even asked where we got such wealth from. In the end, we managed to melt the gold into a kilogram bar. There was even a little bit left over. This remaining part helped us a lot in the difficult 90s. So we never had any problems, for example, with getting you ready for school. 6 months later, Grandpa died. I kept that bullion in the closet under layers of old bedding. I even forgot about it for a while. But now I realize that it's a bad idea to keep jewelry in my underwear, and I need to take it to the bank. I don't know if I'd dare tell you the whole story in my lifetime. Probably not. Forgive me, please, for not being quite frank with you. But there are some things you shouldn't be too quick to tell. Now you know one of the simplest secrets of our family destiny. I hope you'll respond to it with understanding. Be careful with the gold. But sudden wealth always attracts flocks of kites. Take care of yourself. Love you and kisses. Always, your grandmother with tears in her eyes. Of course, she didn't think to take offense at either her grandfather or grandmother. Maggie walked over to the closet that had been against the wall all her life. With difficulty, but she managed to push it back a little. She squatted down and examined the linoleum. Right next to the baseboard, Maggie saw these very incisions of her grandfather's. She wanted to see what the hiding place under the floorboard looked like, but at that moment the intercom rang. Maggie picked up the phone and heard Samantha's familiar voice. Walking up to the apartment, her friend immediately began to question Alexandra. "Well, what happened to you? I've never driven so fast before. You scared me, friend." "Come follow me," Maggie answered her quietly and walked into the room. She sat her friend on the couch, silently took her bag, opened it, and pulled out a bar. "Look what it is." Samantha goggled and didn't take her eyes off the gold. A 1-kilogram bar, pure gold. "May I?" Samantha held out her hands for the bar. Maggie handed it to her. "Wow. Did your grandmother bequeath this to you?" "Yes," Maggie replied and briefly recounted the contents of her grandmother's letter. "You're a good girl, my friend. That's lucky for you. How much is it now in money?" "I don't know. I haven't looked at it yet." Such wealth. She didn't even look. Samantha was surprised and took out her phone. "Okay, let's see. $4,700,000, Maggie." "Yeah, by the standards of our small town, that's a lot of money. That's 2 apartments in your pocket." Maggie was surprised at the value of her inheritance. She thought the bullion would be worth less than $100,000, and here it was worth so much. So no wonder someone was after her. "Have you figured out where you're going to spend the money?" Samantha asked curiously. "No, not yet," Maggie replied. "I didn't call you just because of the bullion." "So what happened?" "When I was coming home with the bullion, someone tried to rob me." "How'd you get away?" "No. A passerby spooked the guy. Then the police came." "I'm really scared." "I see. Someone was jealous of your sudden wealth." "Did the police say anything?" "No, they said they'd look into it. Well, the usual. But I suspect one person. The banker who handled my inheritance. He's the only one who knew I had gold in my bag." "Exactly, I know that little thing." A new breed. Samantha nodded. "I had a banker who, let's just say, almost ripped me off." "Really? You didn't tell me about it?" "Yeah, it was a long time ago. So what did you tell the police about this scumbag?" "No, I was in shock at the time. I only remembered about the banker when I got home." "You didn't tell them about the prime suspect. Let's go to the police right now. You can tell me everything." "What's it like now?" Maggie was surprised. "Well, when else? When you get attacked a second time, or when that banker is on vacation somewhere in the Canary Islands. Let's go now." "What if you think it needs to be done so urgently?" Maggie got up from the couch and started to get ready, but soon stopped. "Wait, Samantha." Maggie sat down and asked her friend to sit down. "Listen, I didn't think at all. Maybe I shouldn't have dragged you into all this. You know, it's very dangerous. Any minute now, they're going to want to do it again. Attack me, break into my apartment. I don't want you near me at that moment because they could kill you." "I don't want to hear that anymore," Samantha replied sternly. "If they come at the 2 of us, it will mean only one thing: we will fight back. So don't worry about me, friend. We've been through worse. And about the apartment, they probably know your address. The bank has all the details. Well, here's what we'll do after the police station. We'll go to my place. You'll stay at my apartment for the duration of the investigation. They don't know my address." "Thank you very much." They hugged and walked downstairs to Samantha's car. On the way, Maggie thought about her friend's courage. I am a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience. Here is the edited text with your recommendations. She hadn't even raised an eyebrow when she knew they could be in danger right now. Maggie chided herself for being suspicious of her friend. Even though she dismissed them right away, it turns out Samantha is even more than a true friend. She is a fearless person. Maggie was so impressed by her friend's words and decisive actions that she didn't even think about the strangeness of Samantha's behavior. What if she was only acting so boldly because she was sure she was safe? It's not like her accomplices are going to attack her themselves, so she's playing the hero. But Alexandra did not care about these thoughts. She thought she should try again to dissuade Samantha from helping her so insistently. At the very least, explain to her that staying with her was not the safest idea. "Samantha, are you sure I won't be in the way?" Maggie asked, hoping for some kind of personal circumstance. Maggie's friend, "Why are you laughing? You know that I have no one to bother you." "I've been living alone for so long," Samantha replied. "We could use a man right now, of course." "Come on, we can manage without men," Maggie replied. She realized that it was pointless to talk her friend out of it and decided not to resist. When they reached the police station, they went to the front office. "Hello, we'd like to make a statement." Samantha began to speak loudly into the window of the duty officer. "Samantha, maybe I should do it," Maggie interrupted her friend, reminding her that she was the victim here. "Yes, of course." Samantha slowed down a bit. "Okay, girls. Can you please decide what you want?" asked the officer on duty irritably. "You see," Maggie began to explain quietly, "I was attacked today. They wanted to rob me." "So you didn't listen." The officer on duty took out a piece of paper from under the table. "Write a statement." "No, you don't understand me," Maggie continued calmly. "The police have already come. I gave them a statement, and they took all the statements they needed." "Then what do you want?" "Wait until they call you," the policeman replied, still irritated. "What's the matter with you? When they call you, then come back." Samantha jumped in. "Can you finish listening to the man, or are you going to interrupt him every 10 seconds? "Okay, woman, who are you?" The employee turned to Samantha. "Do you want me to take you out?" "You don't need to take anyone out." Maggie modestly stood up for her friend. "The point is that I remembered some new circumstances regarding the attack." "I got you." "What's your last name?" said the officer on duty. "Swan," Maggie replied. "Stand by." The desk clerk turned to the computer and typed in Maggie's last name. Then he picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Comrade Major, here on your today's case the victim came. Says new circumstances have opened, that she is even so good. I'll send her to you." The duty officer hung up the phone and turned to Maggie. "Well, your case has already found the right person. Come to the 7th office, they'll meet you there." "How did they find me?" Samantha asked loudly. She was clearly more surprised than Alexandra. Samantha wanted to go with her friend, but the duty officer stopped her. "Citizen, you wait here. No one let you in." "What do you mean, nobody let me in? I'm the victim's friend." Her only support, Samantha began to resent me. "You're a stranger," the cop replied sternly. "Samantha, don't worry. I can handle it," Maggie reassured her friend and walked straight down the hall. The 7th office was not far from the gatehouse. When she reached the door, she stopped. After a few seconds, a man in civilian clothes came out of the office. "Are you Swan?" he asked at once. "Yes," Alexandra answered. "I'm an investigator. Stephen is my last name. I've been handed the case of your assault. Anyway, we found your failed burglar on a hot lead. And who was he? He's a repeat offender. Got out of prison 6 months ago for robbery. Decided to pick up where he left off. Didn't even change neighborhoods. He must have lost his touch while he was in prison. Even forgot about the cameras. 2 hits in an hour, so we got him down quick. Now you'll have to be identified. You caught him so fast, said investigator Stephen. What if he remembers me for the lineup? Maggie was worried. Look, he must have remembered you when he tried to steal your bag. We'll take security measures for your peace of mind, though. You'll be looking at him through mirrored glass. He won't be able to see you. Okay, Maggie replied calmly. The investigator went back into the office and returned 30 seconds later. Come in, everything is ready. Maggie, worried, walked into the office. Along the wall there was indeed a window with a man sitting behind it. Excuse me, is he the only one? And that one is going to sit? Maggie whispered to the investigator. I thought a lineup was when you had to choose among several people. This is a different identification, Stephen whispered back to her. Not only can't he see you, he can't hear you. So you can talk in full voice. Okay, Maggie said, and looked at the man behind the glass. He looked like that man, but he didn't. You see, he was wearing a hat and a scarf, and the scarf covered his face. All you could see was his eyes. Okay, wait a second, said the investigator. He went to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out a cellophane bag with his belongings. Then he went into the bright room where the alleged robber was sitting and handed him the items. The man put on his hat, wrapped himself in a scarf, and the investigator returned to Maggie. Well, that's the way it is now. What do you think? It looks like it now, Maggie exclaimed. The exact replica of the robber was sitting in front of her. That's great. Go into the next office, we'll do the proper paperwork, said Stephen. Maggie went into the next office. A minute later, the investigator went in as well. Tell me, please, have you questioned him yet? Maggie asked. We have. What are you interested in? Stephen asked incredulously. I just wanted to know. Did he say anything about the client? What client? Citizen Swan. The man's a repeat offender. He spent his whole life snatching purses from girls. No one ordered you, don't worry. Oh, really? Well, then I'm free to go, right? Maggie asked. Investigator Stephen handed her a piece of paper. Sign here. And you can go now that you've signed it. Maggie left the investigator's office. No sooner had she reached the front desk than Samantha pounced on her with questions. Did you find it? We did. Some kind of gangbanger. So he acted on his own? Samantha asked. Yes, as it turned out, Lucius had nothing to do with it. The friends went outside and got into the car. What's up? Where should I take you? My place or yours? Samantha asked, pulling out of the police parking lot. Since everything ended so well, let's go to my place. I think we both need a little rest. I've had the wine for almost a year now, Maggie said. Different conversation. Friend Samantha said cheerfully. Are you sure you don't want to come to my place? You're not afraid? Why should I be afraid when they found him? Then it was just a coincidence, and no one ordered me. I get it, Samantha said sneeringly. Are you worried about your diamonds? No, Maggie laughed. I brought them with me. They're in my bag. What Samantha marveled out loud. You've been carrying diamonds with you all this time. Of course, it didn't seem safe to leave them at home, especially in case the police needed them. I didn't know how quickly they'd solve things there. Maybe they'd take them as evidence. I'm amazed at you, Samantha said, her mood changing. They tried to snatch your bag just a couple hours ago, and you're carrying diamonds. Are you so fearless? Why are you so worried? I'm in the car with you. No one knows I'm carrying diamonds. You're lucky to be with me, Maggie said. Okay, maybe you did the right thing. But next time, should I warn you that you have such a valuable cargo with you? They drove in silence to Maggie's apartment. Damn it. I forgot to turn off the lights, she said, looking out of the car at her windows. The meters are counting there, Samantha laughed. She probably has diamonds in her bag. Does she think she's paying her utilities? She parked not far from the driveway. The friends went up to Maggie's apartment. The front door was slightly ajar. Did you forget to lock the door too? Samantha asked in a whisper. I don't remember. This is crazy. Maggie replied and slowly opened the door. She carefully stepped into the hallway and walked into the room. What the hell is this? I knew it. The whole room was trashed, all the cabinets and drawers were open, and things from there were strewn all over the floor. It was the same mess in the kitchen and the other room. What happened here? Samantha asked as she entered the room. There can't be any more coincidences, Maggie said excitedly. They were looking for diamonds. But it could be that. Samantha obviously tried to find another explanation for what had happened, but she couldn't. Yeah, you're right. I don't think it's just a coincidence. And now we'll make sure of it, Maggie said in a shaky voice, and went into the second room. There she went to a cabinet, all the drawers of which had been pulled out. She took one of the drawers and pulled out a small box and an envelope. From the jewelry box, Maggie pulled out earrings, and from the envelope several $100 bills. Look, these are all my rainy day savings. I've had them here for about 5 years. Earrings that a relative gave me. They're not worth as much as diamonds, of course. But they're not cheap either. If they just wanted to make a profit out of this apartment, they'd have taken them anyway. I'm not even talking about the dollars. No, they were looking for diamonds. My grandmother told me to be careful with them. Okay, we need to call the police. Call the detectives, Maggie said, sat down on the couch and looked at Samantha. Look, really, this is getting out of hand. I'm asking you to go home. It's very dangerous with me right now. I'm not interested in hearing you worry about me, Samantha replied firmly. Maggie got up and walked to the front door. She closed all the locks that were there and even put a wooden mop against the handle, making a makeshift lock. Mag, was this lying here? Samantha asked from the room. What do you mean? Maggie walked back into the living room and looked at her friend. Samantha was standing by the desk. All the papers and stationery that had been lying there had been thrown to the floor. The only thing left on the desk was a small note. Maggie walked over to the desk, picked up the note, and read what was written on it. If you value your life even a little, take the diamonds back to where you got them from. Maggie put the note on the table and covered her face with her hands. Mag, what are you doing? Samantha walked over to her friend and hugged her. It's clear now that it's the banker who wants you to return the diamonds to where you took them from. It's clearly a safety deposit box. So he got caught. He thought you'd freak out, quietly bring the diamonds to the bank, and he'd take them for himself. But that's okay. Now you'll tell the police he'll be arrested, and the whole adventure will be over. I really hope so, Maggie whispered back. A few minutes later, the intercom rang. The police had arrived. The task force consisted of 2 detectives and a forensics expert. Hello, I'm Captain Johnson, one introduced himself. This is Senior Lieutenant Smith. Tell me, did you touch anything here before we got here? Yes, a little Maggie replied. Well, you'll still have to give your fingerprints to our expert so we can distinguish them from those of the criminals, said Captain Johnson. He began questioning Maggie, and Senior Lieutenant Smith talked to Samantha. The lieutenant did his job faster and Samantha sat on the couch with Maggie. Captain Johnson continued to ask his questions. Do you suspect anyone? Has anyone threatened you? I've already been assaulted today, and we investigators Stephen was doing. I thought you police had some kind of staff liaison? Look, we can have several attacks like this in a day, and digitalization hasn't reached our department yet, the captain replied. Captain Johnson opened a folder and began to sort through the papers. Stephen, you say? Yeah, I got it, he said, apparently answering someone on his radio. Captain Johnson pulled out some kind of printout and took a quick look at it. So it's a little clearer now, although to be honest, not really. So, you suspect someone? You remember? Yes. I think the banker from the bank is behind this, Maggie said. You know, I expected to hear a lot of things, but not this. What could you have done to stop the banker? Maggie told the captain about her trip to the bank, about her inheritance, showed him the gold bar and held out the note she had left. Who else could it be if it wasn't him? Maggie concluded. Yes, that's very interesting. The captain examined the note from every angle. Did anyone else know about the gold? No, just me and my grandmother, who's been dead for 6 months. What about this girl here? The captain pointed to Samantha. Samantha, come on. She's my friend. And she found out about the gold after the attack. So what if she's a friend? The captain asked. You know, in my practice, I've had more than that. What close people have not attacked each other? Are you out of your mind? Samantha jumped up. I told you I didn't even know he was here. You just want to blame some random person. I get it, you're just bought by this bank. All in on it. Sit down, please, Captain Johnson told her in a stern voice. And control yourself. No one is bought by anyone, and no one is accusing you. And it's my job to suspect everyone, including you. But come on, Maggie interjected. This is really crazy. Samantha was with me the entire evening. She came to my aid at the first call. I don't want you to even suspect her. Unfortunately, our job doesn't depend on your wishes, the captain replied. Well, I think we'll come back to Samantha. The captain walked across the room and turned to Maggie. Here's what I'm not getting. Can you tell me? What's not beating? Maggie asked. It was obvious from the story that Maggie was already tired from the interrogation and sounded irritated and tired. But look, why would your banker set himself up like that? Leave a note. You might say with the exact address of the bank she objected to Captain Johnson. So maybe he was counting on the fact that I, frightened, would run headlong back to the bank to give back the gold without even informing the police. That's right, said Samantha. Maybe they have it all automated. You check it out. We'll check. Captain Johnson looked at Samantha with disbelief. All the more reason not to. Let's say you get scared and take the gold back to the bank. Then the banker gets into your safe deposit box and takes the gold for himself. Okay, let's assume that the whole bank is in cahoots and they intend to take your gold, and none of the security officers or colleagues will ask your banker what he is doing. But still the day will come when you will go to the bank to get your gold. Or just the next day you will get over the shock and run to complain to the police. Then a simple inquiry to the bank will reveal that there is no gold and the bankers will be arrested. It's just one big handmade setup. And if they have such a gangster scheme, why do we have no reports in our department related to this banker and this bank branch in general? With that kind of approach to crime, they'd be as screwed up as they are on the first case. You don't think that's crazy? Maggie shrugged helplessly and sighed. And that's why you suspect me? She asked. Samantha, unlike her friend, was still active. It's my job to suspect everyone, the captain replied. All right, suppose you didn't know about the gold. No, Maggie said quietly. I definitely told Samantha about the possible inheritance when I didn't know what was there. So you knew Captain Johnson pointed his finger at Samantha. The situation became heated because of Captain Johnson's suspicions about Samantha. Captain, did you know that your friend Maggie had some unexpected wealth? What difference does it make what's in there? Even if you didn't know about the gold, you knew that the box could hypothetically contain something expensive. And you had your associates write the note to lead us on a wild goose chase to frame the banker. Isn't that right? Samantha was furious and unable to speak coherently. Maggie answered instead. Maggie, I distinctly remember telling Samantha at work today. I told her that some strange inheritance had come into existence, but that it couldn't possibly contain anything rich. In fact, it's probably a mistake. You must admit these words are hardly the sort of thing that would interest a criminal looking to make a fortune. Captain, maybe. But then tell me, Samantha, where were you when the apartment was robbed? Samantha, well, I already told your colleague everything. I was at the police station waiting for Maggie. Captain, so you weren't near Maggie and you were technically able to make calls and send messages. Samantha started to get indignant, ironically saying that she was supposedly running a gang of robbers from the precinct by phone. She tossed the captain her cell phone, offering to check correspondence and calls. The captain was a little embarrassed by this reaction from Samantha. Captain, okay, I get it. Let's go back to the banker. Let's say this was his first criminal endeavor. An inexperienced crook with a job at a bank at a young age decided to take up theft. The situation was tense. The captain temporarily backed off his suspicions about Samantha and decided to concentrate on the banker version. Captain Johnson once again picked up the note left on Maggie's desk. Captain, there is another circumstance that breaks the banker version. What is the purpose of this criminal group led by the treacherous banker? Samantha, what is it? To prey on lonely people, isn't it? But exclusively in gold? Maggie, what do you mean? Captain, if they wanted to rip you off, why didn't they take the dollars and earrings? It's not $1 million, but it's something. They didn't even bother organizing the whole thing and risking their freedom. Maggie, maybe they don't do small change. Samantha, then cross me out too. My accomplices would need that money too. Captain, yeah, you're right. Maggie, you sure you didn't know there was gold in the box? If your target was just the jewelry, you would have taken what's in here. Samantha sarcastically, really? Are you absolutely sure about that? Should I be searched and detained for 48 hours just in case? I could run away. Captain, tiredly, but why are you making fun of me? I'm telling you, it's my job. Look, these unfortunate bills to us in general, it turns out all versions ruined. So we're going to have to start over. Maggie, think back, please. Who else could theoretically know that you had the gold? Maggie, I don't know. No one but this banker knew I had the gold. But why didn't his accomplices take the other jewelry? I have no idea. Captain, well, we'll go to the bank tomorrow anyway and question him. Look, it's after 1 in the morning and we're still here. Well, thank you for your help with the investigation. If anything changes, you'll get a call right away. Please don't leave and stay in touch. The captain realized that the current leads had reached a dead end. He decided to end the interrogation for today and continue the investigation tomorrow, starting with the banker. Maggie and Samantha were left puzzled as to the motives of the perpetrators. Captain Johnson shifted his gaze to Samantha, and so did you. He signaled for the expert and the lieutenant to wrap up. Maggie started to escort the operatives out, but immediately stopped. Wait a minute, Johnson, she said. I got it. I'm sorry. Are you all right? The captain was surprised at Maggie's sudden insight. Can I get you some water? I understand why they didn't care about the other jewels, Maggie said. They were tasked with finding the gold bar, and it was banker Stephen Gromoff who did it. "Look, you and I have spent so much time sitting here, reasoning, making logical connections," Johnson said. "And now you're back to square one. But no, this version doesn't make sense." The captain persuaded Maggie, but she wasn't listening. She was looking for her grandmother's letter, which was in the gold box in the bank. "What are you looking for?" Johnson asked. "Where is it?" Maggie couldn't find the cardboard envelope containing the letter. "Not that, citizen," said the expert, coming out of the next room with her grandmother's letter in his hands. "Yes," Maggie exclaimed, taking the envelope from the employee. "Thank you. I don't know how it got there." "Now, wait a second," she said, taking the letter out of the envelope and looking for her great-grandfather's lines about imprisonment. "But yes, of course, here it is. Look, Comrade Captain Johnson." Maggie walked up to the captain. One day they were spotted by a worker from the official mines. His name was Damian Gromoff. She read aloud a passage of the letter. "The banker is a descendant, a grandson, I suppose, of a man who had a conflict with my grandfather over gold." Captain Johnson took the letter, read the lines himself, thought for half a minute and said, "That's a very interesting cinematic version. But how can you be so sure that the banker is a descendant of the same Gromoff? You don't even know what this friend or enemy of your grandfather looked like. Of course, our town is small, and the name Gromoff is not the most common. But it's just a theory." "It's not just a theory," Maggie persuaded the captain. "It would be nothing more than an interesting conjecture if it weren't for all the other circumstances," Maggie said. "You lacked motive to make the banker the prime suspect. And now you have one. All the crimes were committed in such a hatchet job because it was really his first case of this kind," she continued. "Well, I mean, where did he get the opportunity to hire someone? That's for you to find out. But most importantly, we now have an answer to the question of motive." "You're right, I don't dispute that," nodded Captain Johnson. "But we still don't have enough evidence to make an immediate arrest. We have to investigate the bank itself. If we go after your banker now, we may not have enough evidence. Moreover, if the court refuses to arrest him because of this, he may flee with his accomplices. So tomorrow morning we'll go to the bank with the group. We'll go to the bank, we'll look up the documentation, and only then we'll charge the banker," the captain decided. "And if he refuses, saying, 'I don't know any Gromoffs, we're just namesakes,' maybe we can think of a way to catch him red-handed. I suggest you hook the chip to the gold bar, or give Samantha a fake gold bar with the chip already embedded," Maggie suggested. "She'll deposit it in a safe deposit box, and as soon as the banker decides to steal it, you'll know about it." "Oh, where are you all going?" Johnson sighed heavily. "Where am I going to get you a fake bullion with a chip for the night? And if you put something on a real one, a banker who has seen such ingots more than once in his life will immediately find out extra details on it. We can't be set up like this. We'll figure it out without chips on the spot. He's got accomplices, and it's possible they're bank employees. So it's important that we get the whole place in a flash." "Then what do we do?" Maggie asked. "Go in good conscience tomorrow morning to another bank," suggested Maggie. "Deposit the gold there. It would be safest. He's not going to clean out a whole bank for a bar." "What about us?" Samantha wondered. "We'll work with your banker," I explained. "But you're just going to leave us here overnight. What if he wants to try again and break into the apartment?" Captain Johnson sighed heavily again. "All right, Comrade Senior Lieutenant. Hasn't the squad car left yet?" "No, it's still there," the policeman answered. "Then you and our driver stay in it near the entrance for the night. Stand there and keep an eye on anyone who comes in here. And the expert and I will go in my car." It was obvious from the senior lieutenant's face that staying the night near the victim's entrance was not in his plans, but he would not disobey orders. The captain took a business card out of his pocket and handed it to Samantha. "Here's my card. If you need anything, call me. The lieutenant will leave his phone number for you too." Samantha thanked the captain, and the task force finally left the apartment. "Well, I'm going too. I won't keep you," Maggie said as she started to pack. "Are you crazy? What if they track you down?" "No, stay here under guard. It's safer." Samantha wouldn't let her friend go home. "But I'd feel safer with you," too, Maggie agreed. "Okay, I'll stay." She went to the window. To think that just a few hours ago I had no idea I'd be guarded by the police. An adventure, don't tell me. Samantha went to the window too and looked down. There was a police truck with its lights on in front of the driveway. "If you tell anyone, they won't believe you," she said. "But I still don't understand. Why couldn't you go straight to the banker's house and arrest him? There's motive, there's evidence. Maybe they were just too lazy to look for him." "Maybe he's not a registered resident?" Maggie suggested. "What then? Do we have to make an inquiry to the bank and talk to colleagues?" "It's not easy to do that at night," said Maggie. "They're hoping to get those records from the bank. I don't like it anyway. What if it's not his shift tomorrow? Then what?" "I don't know," Samantha said. "I don't want to get into the whole investigation thing. I just want it to be over sooner rather than later." "Me too," Maggie said. And the friends were silent for a while. They stared at the wall and listened to the ticking of the antique clock. Each of them was thinking about something else. At one point, Maggie asked, "But now, what have you thought of? What are you going to do with the gold when it's all over?" "Why do you ask for the second time already?" Samantha grinned. "No, let everything be over first, and then I'll think about it. To be honest, I'm less and less happy about this wealth. I'll have to get rid of it sooner rather than later." "From bullion to happiness it does not bring you yet," agreed Maggie, "but not yet. So don't be discouraged. Everything will be solved." The friends began to get ready for bed. Samantha stayed with Maggie in the other room, and she wanted to lie down on the sofa in the living room. "With the lights off," Maggie said. "Listen. Thank you." "For what?" Samantha didn't understand her friend. "When that Captain Swan started to suspect me, you didn't even listen to him. You stood up for me. It only took me a split second to realize you'd believe him." "Oh, really? I had no choice to suspect my friend of robbery. He's a cop. He's so confident in his theories. I'd have believed I'd organized the whole thing." The night was uneventful. Either the criminals were afraid of the police car at the entrance, or they were not going to do anything else today. In any case, the friends managed to get a good night's sleep after a hard day. The next morning, they decided to go to another bank to deposit the gold. Samantha thought for a long time, but did not dare to call Captain Swan to ask how things were going with the capture of the banker. She didn't want to distract the cop from his business. Maggie went straight to the window. "Samantha, did they leave?" she said excitedly. "Maybe they've caught them all and we're out of danger." Samantha suggested timidly, glancing at the empty parking space by the driveway. "All right, let's figure this out. Hurry up with the ingots, then we'll call that Captain Swan." The friends packed up and walked down to the car. Maggie drove very carefully, as if she was driving for the first time and was afraid of hitting someone. "So, no tail? Can't you see it?" she asked Samantha worriedly. "No, I'm fine." "Go ahead," Samantha replied calmly, looking carefully through all the windows. But no sooner had the car left the courtyards and entered the main street than it was struck in the side by an old Jiguli. Two young men got out of them, came up to Maggie's car and started pounding with their hands, demanding to open the door. "Stay where you are," Maggie said loudly, checking that the doors were locked. I'm sitting. Samantha pulled out her cell phone and began frantically dialing Captain Swan's number. At that moment, one police car and one civilian car pulled up to the scene of the accident. The operatives who came out of there quickly rounded up the two assailants and placed them in the police car. One of the operatives was Captain Swan, who approached Maggie's car. Maggie didn't immediately realize she had to open the door, but she let the policeman into the back seat. "I apologize for putting you through this," the captain said, "but there was no quicker or more effective way to catch the accomplices red-handed." "So you mean to say that you sent us to give the gold to another bank on purpose?" Samantha asked after a bit of shock. "I'm telling you, it was the quickest and most efficient way. But we didn't have hard evidence. We didn't. All those amazing stories about grandfathers and a conniving banker sounded convincing, but not to a court of law. And now we've got ironclad. I think we'll finish them off for a while and they'll give up their banker. Don't worry about the car, we'll sort it out. The main thing is that you are alive and well, and all the criminals are caught," said Captain Swan. "But almost all of them, like almost. The banker hasn't been caught yet," surprised Maggie. "In the next few hours, I think he'll be caught. So let's get in my car. I'll drive you to your bank. The car will be examined by experts. Then it will be taken to the service parking lot. So I'll be your cab driver today." Captain Swan drove Samantha and Maggie to another bank where Samantha successfully deposited the bullion in a safe deposit box. The friends never recovered from the emergency shock and therefore could not realize the extent of the danger the captain had put them in. Probably if they had realized it, they would have communicated with the captain differently. On the way out of the bank, the policeman's cell phone rang. "Hello, I'm listening." "Oh yeah? Is this it? That's great. We'll be there soon." The captain hung up the phone and turned to his girlfriends. "Well, you'll never guess the names of today's attackers." "Was it Stephen?" Samantha asked in surprise. "That's right. It's the whole family gang. The attackers are your banker's brother and nephew who just turned him in. We have information that Stephen is on shift today, so I suggest we go right now to apprehend him." 10 minutes later, the captain's car and his entourage were outside the bank where Stephen worked. Another police car was already parked near it, and the patrol officers together with the senior lieutenant were waiting for a command from the captain. "You two," the captain looked at the patrolman. "Go to the service entrance of the bank. The lieutenant and I will go in from the front." The captain shifted, looking at Samantha. "Do you want to come with us?" "Yes," Samantha answered unexpectedly firmly. She wanted to look into the eyes of the criminal who had arranged such an adventure for her. The captain, the senior lieutenant, and Samantha walked leisurely into the bank. The captain silently showed his ID to the bank employee standing at the entrance and made his way into the hall. At the farthest window sat Stephen. He saw the operatives at first, but paid no attention to them, probably because they were in civilian clothes. But when Samantha came into his field of vision, Stephen jumped up, looked around, and rushed toward the office. "He's so fast." Captain Swan grinned and headed for the service room. It opened with a special card, so he asked the bank employee sitting at the next window to let them through. The captain took his time. He realized that his colleagues had probably already grabbed Stephen on the way out. When the female employee opened the door, it turned out that this was indeed the case. In the bank's small employee break room sat Stephen, with two patrolmen standing beside him. Apparently, the banker did not resist the arrest. "But why are you running, mister?" "Stephen, we wanted to talk to you, and you're running." The captain sat down on the chair opposite him. "I won't tell you anything." "I need a lawyer," Stephen whispered back. He will," a lawyer, the captain assured him. "But your relatives have already testified. Yesterday's call detail from your home phone won't work in your favor either. Moreover, we even know everything about the motive. At that time, a stately man in his 60s entered the room. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Service room." "Operational activities," answered the captain. "And who are you, exactly?" "The bank manager," the man replied in a bass voice. "You're just in time, Mr. Manager. Your employee is suspected of organizing a theft and attempt on human life." "What attempt on life?" Stephen was surprised. "What kind of attempt? And when a car deliberately crashes into another car, is that not attempted murder?" The captain asked him. "What have they done?" The banker covered his face with his hands. "Or maybe your relatives made it up, and you had nothing to do with it." "No," Stephen whispered. "It was all my idea." "Yes, you see how wonderful. You don't even deny anything," summed up Captain Swan. "Stephen, how could you?" Stephen was shamed by the superintendent. "You've been one of the best employees in years. Not a single suspicion or reprimand. And now you've decided to take advantage of a client and retroactively terminate your employment. I don't want our bank's name on any criminal reports." "If it's any consolation," Captain Swan said to the manager, Stephen wasn't acting out of self-interest. He didn't want to profit from his clients, he was motivated by personal motives. But of course, to do such a thing because of some dispute from the past does not justify it. The captain turned to the senior lieutenant. "Comrade Senior Lieutenant," asked the bank manager a few questions. The lieutenant left to talk to the manager. Only Captain Swan, Samantha, and Stephen remained in the room. Patrolmen stood near the entrance. "This isn't just a dispute from the past," Stephen began to say. "It was a matter of honor, family honor." He looked at Samantha penetratingly. "Your grandfather framed mine and took away what was rightfully our family's." "What are you talking about?" "I know the story. My grandfather didn't set anyone up. Did your grandfather rat on him, which is why we put him away?" "Of course he did. Who would tell you the truth? Listen to me. Your grandfather simply took the gold my grandfather made. At first, my grandfather managed to get some justice and helped put your grandfather in jail. But he never returned the gold. Therefore, when my grandfather came to ask for his gold again after his release, your grandfather set him up, imitated an attack on himself. He wrote something to the police, and that was it. By that time, my grandfather worked almost all the time at distant mines, and his health was badly shaken. Of course, he couldn't stand the prison term and died. And then I saw your surname, saw the gold, clarified the personal data of your grandmother. And it all made sense to me at once. I called my brother, and we hatched a plan to get the gold from your apartment. I gave him and my nephew the address. They drove there and waited for you. You won't believe this, but they witnessed the attack on you. So the two men who approached me during the attack were your relatives?" Samantha wondered. "Apparently, yes. That's what they told me. Then my brother and nephew waited until you left home and started looking for gold." "We didn't find the gold," Stephen continued. "We realized that the day after the incident you would definitely go to another bank to deposit it. So we decided to take the most radical step possible. They didn't have to come at you. I'm sure it was an accident. The plan was simply to stop the car and ask for the gold." "Asking is a good idea," Captain Swan replied sarcastically. "We did not want to put your life in danger, but the honor of the family." The captain shouted to the patrolman, "Take this one down to the station." The cops led Stephen away, and the captain and Samantha walked out the service entrance and stopped. "Wait, I just don't get it. Who was this first attacker who wanted to take my purse from my front doorway?" Samantha asked. "Just a mugger," replied Captain Swan. "Coincidence. It would have been a surprise if he'd been able to snatch your purse and seen the gold in it. The people who rescued me were going to rob me. Samantha sighed heavily. And there's more to the story. I should believe him, not my grandmother. You don't have to believe anything, the captain reassured her. Both versions have a right to exist. But if Stephen sincerely believed that my grandfather framed his grandfather, then his reaction is understandable. There are many mitigating circumstances in this case, and personal motive, and carelessness, and the fact of saving you from the first robber. But still, they committed a crime and will get the punishment they deserve. I don't think they'll be in jail for very long, but a couple of years for sure. Well, we'll see what the court decides. It's been a while since then. The court took into account all the mitigating circumstances and sentenced the banker, his brother and nephew, to 1.5 years in a penal colony. After the trial, Samantha decided to go to the bank again, only to the bank where she had deposited the gold. When she came out of there, she called Kate and offered to meet her at her house. An hour later, the friends were sitting on the couch in the living room drinking tea. Well, I reread Grandma's letter and thought it over, Maggie said. Indeed, it was dangerous to own gold, so I've decided to get rid of it. What? Samantha was surprised. You sold the bullion? I did. Maggie went to her bag and pulled out a puffy envelope. It's for you, she said. Samantha took the envelope in her hands and pulled out a wad of bills. Thank you, let's just say it's for car repairs, Maggie said. But insurance covered most of it, didn't it? Well, it's just for moral damages. You've suffered so much because of me, taking risks, getting in accidents. I can't imagine how you must have felt when you suffered so much because of my problems. Oh, come on, man, it's an adventure, Samantha exclaimed. My life is home, work, home, work. At least here I have some variety. Did it make you feel needed? I haven't felt as much emotion in the last 5 years as I did that day. So how could I say no to your help? You couldn't. Somehow I didn't even think you could say no. So I'm asking you to take this envelope, consider it another request. Thank you. Samantha carefully put the envelope in her bag. And the rest of it? Have you finally figured out where to spend it? She asked and laughed. Yes, this time I have, Maggie replied, smiling. It took me a long time to think about it, but where? Should I go into real estate? I've heard that the market is in demand right now and we need to act fast. No, not real estate, Maggie said calmly. What about stocks? Oh, come on. I don't know anything about stocks. But you've always been a smart girl. And not in stocks. Then where? You see, this money, this gold, it's really of dubious origin. Of course, I believe every word my grandmother said, but some of the information she might not have known. That's why I didn't dare to spend the money just to enrich myself. There's a foundation called Singing Hearts. It helps sick children. It seemed right to send the rest of the money there. I live alone. I have a salary and an apartment. And they need the money badly. I think this will be the best final chord in the half-century-long dispute between the two families.